We are in live session, and I now welcome you all and open this morning's meeting for communities. We do have a quorum, and I call the meeting to order and welcome all members to this meeting. Can I remind anyone in the public gallery that mobile phones must be turned off, mobile tablet devices can however be used through a Wi-Fi connection, and all devices should be muted. Password details are available in the gallery for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi network. No recordings or photographs may be taken. May I remind members about the protocols regarding the use of electronic devices. Please switch all mobile devices to airplane mode and activate Wi-Fi connection. Please use tablet devices discreetly and in a way which does not interfere with proceedings, and be aware of cameras when using the device. And I would also like to remind everyone of the sensitivity of the microphones. So, apologies then, Clerk. Do we have any?
Morris Bradley has apologised.
Okay, apology from Morris. Any members aware of any other apologies? No, thank you. Item 2 then, members' chairperson's business. Members, I am conscious that we have heard from the Minister and in the media about the forthcoming bill on defective premises. Although we have asked for additional information in relation to the scope of the bill and timeframes for introduction, I would like to make a number of proposals. Just to also let members know, I have received a letter from the Royal Society of Ulster Architects, which will be added to committee correspondence for next week, seeking an opportunity to brief the committee in relation to protecting homeowners from defective buildings. In order to prepare our members content that we seek a raised paper and briefing on examples of equivalent or similar approaches to legislation in other legislatures and what their experience has been. Yes, members content, thank you. Our members also content that in the event that there may be a request for accelerated passage, the committee formally request an advance briefing from departmental officials prior to the introduction of the bill to the House.
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Agreed. And I would further propose that we invite the Assembly's Bill Office officials to brief the committee, setting out for members the timescales, risks and potential implications on the legislation making process when accelerated passage is sought for a bill. Our members agreed with that?
Agreed.
Yeah. Thank you, members. Item 3, members, draft minutes. I refer you to there at page 6 of your meeting pack. Are members content to agree the minutes of 18th of April as drafted?
Agreed.
Thank you, members.
Sorry, can I just go back to page 22?
Yep.
I'm just looking here. Sorry, my Surface Pro's having a fit at the moment. I think that's within the minutes, and it was the presentation from the Housing Executive that was included. On page 22, it talks about the review of the housing transfer application form, and while it doesn't ask for information on disability, the question hasn't been answered that was asked. I was asking why disability wasn't included. The form says that it has to ask equality questions. They then said that they will talk to somebody about their disability at a later stage. That's not what the form's about. If we could maybe go back to them and just say, can they clarify if that form asks for equality questions? If that's the case, then it should be all the Section 75 categories. If it's
that's going to come up in matters of raising. So if you just pause there a minute, it will come up in matters of raising.
Okay.
So I just hold. So we'll come to that matters of raising. Can we agree draft minutes? Just yep. Thank you. Members, you have been provided there at page 16 with a departmental reply to committee queries on vacancies and temporary promotions and vacancies within the department. The reply provides information on a temporary promotion policy, whether the policy is used appropriately, plans to reduce the numbers of temporary promotions, recruitment competitions and agency staff costs. A considerable amount of information. Do members have any comments or are they content to note?
I'm not sure whether it's directly linked, but I'm not sure whether everybody else in the committee received communication this week regarding hybrid working within the department, being reduced from 40% to 20%. I just feel that's really going to have a massive impact on recruitment, particularly those who are working in rural areas within the department. I'm just wondering, was that ever brought before committee? Was that decision brought before? It would be something for staff within the department being reduced now from 40%. I know that it's operational, but it just, for me, I think that it is going to massively impact on the retainment of staff. Yep. So is there something that we can ask about that, whether that is a change of policy over the whole of the civil service, or is it just the department?
Well, why don't we get the letter into the clerk and then take it as and take it through that? I think that'll probably be best. Get it officially onto the business in that way. Yep. Okay, so members otherwise content to note that on the temporary positions. Thank you. Members, then you've been provided page 21 with a response from the Housing Executive following their briefing session at the meeting on 21st of March. That response covers detail in relation to emergency housing demand and supply in rural areas, a review of the housing transfer application form and why it does not ask for information on disability, specific information in relation to the housing needs test in the Causeway Coast and Glens, information on the review of the Disabled Facilities Grant and the changes and improvement that have been made, information on the amount of land belonging to the Housing Executive, and an update on figures and information in relation to tenancy fraud. So, Kelly, you have a comment in relation to that?
It was on page 22. Apologies, I had bookmarked it, but it jumped up into my draft minutes instead of staying in matters arising. It was about that on page 22, about the my Surface Pro's having a fit. It just was to say that in 22, the paper that we've received from the Housing Executive, it didn't answer the question that I was asking. It's the form alludes to the fact that these are questions they're asked about equality questions they're required to ask. However, section 75 are the equality questions that should be asked, and disability isn't included. Now, it goes on to say that if someone has a disability, they'll then find out about it, but this is the first application. If they're going to ask a quality question, ask a quality question. If you're going to ask about what people's needs are for housing, ask those. I would just like to find out if that form is, the housing transfer application form, is asking an equality question or a housing needs question. And then, if I may, just going on then to page 26.
Just let's agree, are members content with that, to seek that for the
The housing
clarification?
transfer application form is asking an equality question or asking a
Housing needs question.
housing needs question.
Okay, Kelly, and then your comment on page 26.
26. At last, we have brand new, as they indicate here, brand new guidance that's going to be issued for the Disabled Facilities Grants. If we could write to the Housing Executive, they say that that's due out for distribution from May 2024. It would be very useful if through this committee we could ask Chair for copies of that guidance to be made available to all MLA offices across Northern Ireland.
Excellent idea. Members content with that?
Yep.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. So then, moving on to page 31, there's a reply in from the department in relation to our queries on questions on the briefing by the Deputy Secretary of the Work and Health Group. So that reply focuses on the issues of barriers to uptake for all support programmes, economic analysis of employment support programmes, review of welfare reform mitigations, and social sector size criteria, otherwise known as the bedroom tax. Do members have any comments, or are they content to note at this point? Content to note? Yeah, go
It would
ahead,
just be
Shan.
good to hear just even some of the details about that ongoing review for recovering overpayments related to the social size, whether there is a workaround being explored, and how does the department ensure that recovery process for repayments is fair, really?
Okay.
It's just something that's really
Ryan?
worrying.
Yeah, but I'd be interested at some stage if we could get, whether it's presentation or more information on the labour market partnerships. I know it's a strong link to economy, but it operates under the Department for Communities, with one for each council area. Just in terms of seeking how different sectors working together to improve employability, address economic inactivity, and promote job opportunities. So it's very important that we have that cross-sectoral working. So I don't know if that is on our schedule at any stage.
Probably not specifically,
No.
but we could see what we can.
I can.
The whole area of employability is an important sector. That we've a letter later, with the Belfast Works Consortium. But I'd be interested to find out more of that work being led by the councils through the labour market partnerships.
Members content that the clerk will see if that could be arranged. Yep. Okay, and you have Shan's.
Yes, I have.
Clearly enough,
Shans,
yeah. Thank you, members. Moving on then to information provided, page 39, which is a reply from Department of Finance to committee queries on vacancies and temporary promotions. That reply includes information on civil service and DFC temporary promotions by analogous grade and duration, civil service partial retired staff and temporary promotion, DFC vacancies at grade 3 to 7, and vacancies filled between November 20 and 24 and February 24. Do members have any comments, or are they content to note that for now? Content to note, yeah. Thank you. Members, you've been provided page 47 with the departmental reply to committee queries on questions from the briefing by Deputy Secretary of Operation Delivery Group. That reply provides information on the level of benefit fraud and how information is shared, a list of disability consultative organisations, the number of people with a debt to be paid back as a result of benefit error, work to address the recommendations of the Public Service Ombudsman report on PIP, a breakdown by directorate of permanent staff and agency staff to include information on what projects or programmes of work the agency staff are assigned to, and the individual numbers affected by mitigation payments being made straight to a housing body or landlord rather than to the individual. Any comments at this stage or content to note, members? Content to note?
Can I just ask on the repayments to the landlord, how timely they are? Because I'm very aware of cases where it's taking a bit of time and the person is being, to be honest, warned with eviction because of lack of payment. It would be, even if the department could give us a headline on how quickly those repayments are made.
Yeah. Members content to seek that? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
that
you.
one.
Okay, members, and if we could also get an indication there whether that's how it sits in terms of relation to other years. Is it worsening, or is it getting worse, or is it improving? Or I think it would be useful
The payment rates.
over a number of years. Yeah,
Okay.
the time frames for the payments to be
Time
made.
frames.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, members. Then at page 107, there's a response in relation to the Causeway Coast and Glens growth deal. Council has been awarded a 72 million growth deal package supported by the British Government and the Executive. The Department of Finance and the Council currently have plans in place for the Causeway Coast and Glens deal heads of term to be signed as of yesterday, and it was, I believe, I've seen it covered there. So members, so that deals with that. Members, then you've been provided page 109 with a paper from the Chartered Institute of Housing in relation to the revitalisation of the Housing Executive, which was requested following their recent briefing here. Do members have any comments in relation to that? Or
I just think it's critically important, obviously, that we need to see the housing supply strategy, but as part of that as well as the revitalisation of the Housing Executive. So I'm wondering if we could get a more detailed briefing, and I know the Minister confirmed that they're working on it. What are the officials working on? Where is it at? And further detail on it. I think it's imperative that we need to drive forward in relation to it, and particularly in relation to social rents. I would like to hear the trajectory of rents and ensuring that rents will be and remain affordable within the overall case in the revitalisation of the Housing Executive as well. But I think we really need to see much more detail on it and continue to ensure that it's driven forward by the department.
That writing to the department via the DALO, writing to the Minister, writing to the department for officials to brief.
And if I
okay, thank you, Kelly.
The Chartered Institute of Housing has presented quite a number of options regarding the revitalisation of the Housing Executive. I hear quite often that so many things can't happen because it's not within the rules. Would it be worthwhile if we could seek from the Department for Finance clarification on the rules regarding the setup of the Housing Executive and how any of these options may or may not be legally able to go forward? I'm just very aware that any borrowings on the Housing Executive will land on the books for this place. But to be honest, I need somebody with a more financial understanding of the workings of how a body like the Housing Executive works within our government, to understand about these options. So I don't know whether we can ask the Department of Finance if they could review these and clarify if they are with or without scope.
Yep.
Provide the Chartered Institute of Housing paper with the options and ask.
Just for clarification, how their opinion on whether they're within or without scope of the current arrangements, because some of these could be valuable options to consider with the revitalisation, but I'm not an economist. I'd need somebody with a financial head on to look at that.
I think it's important that ethos of the Housing Executive remain as a proper public housing body, and for me, I have to say, I thought the options 1 and 2, and it would be interesting to hear where we are, particularly on option 2 in relation to Treasury and negotiations around that. I think it would be interesting to maybe include that as part of the update.
Okay.
Okay, members, thank you. Then at page 113, members, there's a memo from the clerk in relation to the briefings we received recently on housing issues. So we do need to look at, consider points 10 to 15 of the memo and decide how we wish to proceed with those. So I'll start here at point 10 and we'll just go through them quickly and ask members how they wish to proceed. So 10 was in relation to an agreement was reached to ask the Department for Communities whether there were plans to place neighbourhood renewal on a statutory footing. Reference was made to seeking a briefing or response from the DFC to the neighbourhood renewal paper. Does committee wish to seek any further briefing from the Department in relation to neighbourhood renewal policy or programme delivery? And I have to say, I would feel that we should do that. That's an important strand, and it's a bit unclear at the minute where it's going. So I would be in favour of. So yes, we'll seek further clarity.
The only concern I would have is that we'll get the usual line back from the department. We'll have to wait for the budget. Now I'm hoping that the budget may be agreed today by the executive. Maybe it's timely that we do push for that now, but as soon as the minister does know what his allocation of funding is, I think that he should be considering neighbourhood renewal. I know everything can't be a priority, but to not do neighbourhood renewal is just unfathomable.
So members content with that, thank you.
Chair,
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
well, in terms of neighbourhood renewal, I mean, it's relevant. I don't know if it's referenced further down to the whole people in place strategy. The funding comes through for it, which has been under review for I don't know how many years, without progressing. So maybe we'll get that anyway, but that's the wider context for it,
Yeah, okay, so content with that.
Just we also need information on that review.
Yeah, that overall context, yeah. Okay, thank you. Item 11 then, members, is NIFA outlined the need for an executive to enhance the budget to build social homes. So committee previously had received correspondence in relation to budget 2024-25, which included a reference to capital bid requirement for housing. The associated notes indicate that the social housing target in 2024 is 2,050 homes. Do committee wish to seek an update from the department in relation to an updated position on the 24-25 budget to include the capital forecast and allocation for social homes? Members agree to that, yeah. Thank you.
Chair, and also just the actual delivery against the target, because I think it was 1,500 last year. So it's one thing having a budget and a target, but the other question is is that being met? So the target hasn't been met in recent years.
That's because
of the budget. Well, I don't know if it's only the budget.
No, it was the budget.
It was clearly because of the budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was no executive here and no budget, so that's why we lost 500 houses.
Yeah.
But I do think there are other factors in terms of developments coming forward from housing associations which are not able to advance issues such as NI water infrastructure. So
once we have the further,
we'll get that back.
Once we have the further information, then I suppose we can drill into.
Just to expand on that point, Chair, perhaps maybe it'd be prudent to ask then, following on from Brian's query, within the last 5 years, for a breakdown of targets, whether they've been met or not, and where they haven't been met, what the reason for them not being met were.
Particularly in relation to, we do understand that in relation to the targets for rural housing haven't been met, so in particular, focus on that.
And just on that point, I agree entirely with Brian as well too. It's not just the issue of budget, because even if the budget had been there, they still weren't going to meet the targets. I think if we addressed some of those issues even the last days.
They were. The plan permission and stuff is already through. These were 2,000 new starts.
Yeah, I'm not Chair dismissing the issue of the budget, but I'm aware of various housing associations who had planned, are in the programme. We're hoping to commence, and then they're knocked back on issues of water infrastructure. So I'd just be interested to hear what other are the main factors, because the housing executive now and the department is essentially rely on housing associations coming forward with actual plans. Quite often that's how things get into the social housing development programme. Rather than the department choosing sites.
Well, those are the issues around housing. Like, those are going to be ongoing work for the committee. All I'm asking at this point in time is that we seek further clarity on the budget. I think all those issues are going to remain in the mix for a considerable period of time. They're going to be a large part of the work of the committee ongoing. Ciara, and then Karen.
I think we just need clear clarity on how the target's set of 2,050 and it has been 2,000 every year. However, with no budget. The target was 1,500 the previous year. So how is that target set? What is the data that's being utilised to set that target, which then dictates the budget? Because I would like to see more than 2,050 homes built, but 2,000 has been the general target set by the department, and then that equates to the budget. So we needed the data, and I'd like to unpack what is the evidence to say that that's what's required for the social housing development programme on an annual basis.
Yeah. So members content with that element of Brian and Ciara's both to be included? Kelly?
I think we need to be very clear that housing associations, and I've been round quite a number of them on personal visits to them, have applied to have social houses built, and they have been turned down because the housing executive criteria hasn't been met. And rural areas in particular have been one of those that have had them turned down. I've asked for the updates for my own local area of what the allocations that have been put forward by the housing executive. I don't agree with their criteria, but it's what they have set. Housing associations and developers would take your arm off to be able to build more, but the housing executive's criteria restricts. I did ask the housing executive for their criteria and how they're making those decisions, because we have such a housing crisis. I just think if you build, people will fill them.
Yeah.
But that criteria is something I think we need clarification on, as Ciara has said.
Okay. So, Clerk, are you content you have the detail of that? Okay.
So that last question is to the housing executive for their criteria, whereas the question on the targets for building is to the department.
Yeah.
The criteria, the department has to sign off
Set
the
by
housing
the
executive as their delivery body for
Right.
this. So they must sign off the criteria. The criteria is curtailing building. Now we've got a terrible budget, but actually the criteria stops building.
Got that.
Okay, thank you. One moment. So, moving on then, so we're content there, members, thank you. Moving on to item 12, should there be a retrofitting strategy here in the north? Is there an agreed definition of retrofit and an established standard? What is being done to incentivise and support retrofitting across tenures? And that was raised previously. So the clerk is seeking to establish, is committee seeking further information or update in relation to retrofitting? Kelly?
There's no action agreed at
There's-
the
there's
committee
no
that
specific
time,
action agreed,
so
so-
that was in the note.
Should we ask in writing formally from the Department for Communities and the Department of the Economy if they have a plan to have a retrofitting strategy? And Chair, I know this is sort of separate to this, but we have actually an expert company in Northern Ireland that has been working in the south on retrofitting plans since 2008. I don't know whether it's worthwhile to ask them to give us a briefing in writing or in person at some point.
Even, yeah.
And that's Bayview Contracts in Newry. I visited them and visited some of their homes. It's not as if I'm going to promote just one company, but it's the fact that they have been working on retrofitting strategy since 2008 gives them a different angle to this. It's very, very impressive work by a local company.
Okay, and are they the only kind of operators in that area, or what's?
There are others, but this one is one that has worked on the strategy in the south. So
Okay. So would members be content we seek a written briefing to see what information that sheds? And then in relation to the retrofitting, are you clear enough now,
Yeah,
Clerk?
right, ask in writing to both the Department for Communities and the Department for Economy if there is a plan for a retrofitting strategy.
Yep, thank you. Item 13, members, committee heard about a statutory duty to cooperate and a legislative duty to prevent homelessness. We heard that from Homeless Connect. Do committee wish for a request to make a request to raise to specifically include information on other jurisdictions where legislative reform has introduced a duty to prevent homelessness and require government departments to work together? So was that sum up the committee's requirement on that? Did we get a raised briefing on other jurisdictions? Members content?
Yes.
Yeah. Item 14, members, we heard from the Housing Rights about the lack of specific data here in relation to mortgage debt, mortgage vulnerability and support for mortgage interest. Does committee wish to ask the department whether it is able to access information in relation to mortgage vulnerability? Yeah, members content with that. And we heard then from Chartered Institute of Housing about the need for the department and or the housing executive employing their own occupational therapists, members will recall, in order to be able to undertake adaptation assessments. Does committee wish to ask the department and the housing executive whether there are plans to secure in-house OTs for this purpose? Yeah. Okay, members. So, yeah. So that's your content of that. Thank you. Okay. Members, moving back then to table papers. At page 3, there's a departmental reply to committee queries on welfare reform mitigations. The reply provides information on timeframes for the updating work, the next steps relating to independent panel's recommendations, the number of staff working on the welfare mitigation review work, and if work is being undertaken to identify the costs. So do members have any comments, so they're content to note? Bearing in mind we have Les Allenby here this morning as well. Content to note that response? Yep, thank you. At page 7, members, of your table papers then is a departmental reply to committee queries following the briefing session by the Deputy Secretary of the Departmental Corporate Services Group. The reply provides information in terms of an analysis of the impact of staff vacancies on the service it provides, whether staff vacancies have had an impact on the development of any of the social inclusion strategies, the length of time the posts have been vacant within the department, a breakdown of the additional 13.2 million allocated to social housing, a timescale for the publication of each of the social inclusion strategies, an overview of all the department's ongoing planned and completed capital projects, an overview of the department's current reliance on EU funding for its programme delivery since exit from the EU, and issues relating to programme delivery in the short, medium and long term due to any anticipated EU funding changes. Do members have any comments, or are they content to note? Content to note.
Can I just ask, I appreciate the information that has been provided is very useful. One of the things I still have a concern about, where there is staff shortages, that could lead to the move to universal credit extending from 5 weeks to beyond that. Can we write, perhaps with obviously Chair, with the committee's permission, to ask if there's a possibility where someone goes beyond the 5 week wait into 6 or 7 weeks, that there's an automatic discretionary support grant payment made to that person?
Members content?
Or if they would consider, the committee would, or the department would consider that?
Ask the department for their
If they will do that,
yeah,
because to be honest,
if they will
this
consider
is an individual in Northern Ireland whose benefits are then being delayed because of an issue internally.
Yeah.
And is there something then that we can do proactively to counter that?
Okay, so members content to ask the department to raise that? Yep, thank you. Moving on then to members then agenda item 5, which is a briefing from Carers NI. So the briefing paper for this, members, is at page 120 of your pack there. And I will now welcome the following representatives to our meeting this morning. So, hi, I'd now like to welcome Angela Phillips, Senior Policy and Engagement Officer, and Craig Harrison, who is the Public Affairs Manager, both with Carers NI. So, Craig, can I invite you to make a brief opening statement, 5 minutes please, before we move to questions and answers. And I will just say that I am a member of the all-party group on Carers up to yesterday. In fact, the chair of that group. We had our AGM yesterday. So, but with that being stated, Craig, would you go ahead and make your presentation, please?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to join you today and talk about the urgent need to improve the financial support that's provided to people through the Carers Allowance system in Northern Ireland. The written briefing that we submitted to the committee in advance of today has a lot of detail on those issues, and I'll just spend a few short minutes highlighting some of the key points from that. As the committee's well aware, Carers Allowance is the main social security support for unpaid carers in Northern Ireland, and it's provided to just over 48,000 people here today. Carers Allowance is available to those who spend a minimum of 35 hours a week providing unpaid care for a sick or disabled family member or friend, although for many people who are in receipt of the benefit, their caring role extends far beyond that, and indeed it's often the case that people who receive Carers Allowance are caring around the clock every day of the year. Now, in exchange for that immense caring role, what they receive is a flat weekly payment of £81.90 per week, and it's paid at that flat rate regardless of how many additional hours they may spend caring and regardless of how many more people they may be caring for all at once. And so what that means is that at the absolute most, Carers Allowance is worth £2.34 per hour. For those who are caring around the clock, that £2.34, that's the equivalent of nearly 5 times less than the national living wage. For those who are carrying around the clock, of course, and doing much more than the 35 hours per week, the benefit is worth pennies per hour to them. So within that context, the committee won't be surprised to hear that carers allowance is among the lowest benefits of its kind in the entire social security system. And it's even less surprising that so many people who receive it in Northern Ireland today are living lives defined by devastating financial hardship and poverty. Just to put some numbers to that, Carers NI's research has shown that 46%, so nearly half of people who receive carers allowance in Northern Ireland today, are living below the poverty line. 1 in 3 are struggling to afford to eat. 1 in 4 are cutting back, 1 in 4 have experienced debt, and more than 40% are cutting back on essentials like heating in order to make ends meet. If we compare the general carer population in Northern Ireland to those who receive carers allowance, people who receive carers allowance are nearly twice as likely to need to use a food bank as the general carer population. And so all in all, this committee will search long and hard before it will find another single component of the social security system which is so closely linked to such severe levels of hardship and poverty. Now, in our written briefing to the committee, we provided extensive testimony from unpaid carers where they talk about their experiences of trying to make ends meet on carers allowance, and I really would encourage members to read that in full. But even based on the data that I've just outlined, we cannot escape the conclusion that carers allowance isn't fit for purpose. Whenever we have carers coming to us and saying that they're making their own female sanitary products because they can't afford to buy real ones in a shop, we can't escape the conclusion that carers allowance is not fit for purpose. Whenever we have carers who describe being a breaking point because of the abject poverty they're living in, the direct quote, we cannot escape the conclusion that carers allowance is not fit for purpose. And whenever we have carers who are lying to their children about being on a diet so they don't ask the real reason why they're skipping meals, we cannot escape the conclusion that carers allowance is not fit for purpose. The carers allowance system is in need of root and branch reform in Northern Ireland, but the one measure that we're asking the Minister to prioritise during the rest of this Assembly mandate is delivery of the carers allowance recognition payment that was recommended by the Independent Review of Welfare Mitigations in 2022. That was closely modelled on a similar policy that's existed in Scotland since 2018, and it would put over £540 per year more into the pockets of people who receive carers allowance via twice yearly lump sum payments. Now, our research has shown that delivery of that recognition payment in Northern Ireland would immediately lift 3,400 unpaid carers out of poverty and an additional 2,500 carers out of deep poverty, which is the situation where their household income is 50% below the poverty line. Beyond those headline poverty figures, evidence from Scotland has shown that delivery of this payment can also help carers to pay for essential household bills that they otherwise would have struggled to afford, to clear their debts, and as a consequence of that, to improve their mental well-being. Now, we're well aware, I suppose, that delivery of that extra payment isn't going to fix everything for all unpaid carers in Northern Ireland, but we're trying to pursue a pragmatic approach that would have the maximum impact for the maximum number of unpaid carers within the time and financial constraints that the department is operating under. And so just to conclude, Chair, we have to recognise that unpaid carers in Northern Ireland make a multi-billion-pound contribution to this place every year. If they disappeared even for one day, public services would collapse. And in return for such an immense contribution, they deserve more than a social security system that systematically traps them in poverty. And they deserve more than a social security system that exploits them and that tells them that the around-the-clock devotion they have toward their loved ones is worth no more than pennies per hour to the state. Now, the carers allowance recognition payment won't fix that for everyone, as I said, but it is an important starting point, and we think there's a strong moral and financial case for the Minister to prioritise it during the rest of this Assembly mandate. So thank you very much for your time, and we'd of course be happy to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Craig, and I think I just do want to recognise on behalf of the committee the role that unpaid carers are playing out there, and you ended your comments on this issue, but it is worth stating again that the entire health and social care system would indeed collapse without that input from carers. I know from my own experience as a social worker the pressures they are under, and I know that in some cases, you know, the support is just entirely non-existent or not sufficient, and put them under severe pressure of burnout, severe pressure for their own mental and physical health. Also massive impacts in terms of career progression, pensions, all of these issues. And the other thing to say, like, these are issues that will impact all of us likely at some period in time. So I think it's incumbent on us to really take notice and try to seek to make a real difference. And I know that is why, and I've mentioned previously the all-party group for carers, and I was a founder member of that group in recognition of that, with others here in the committee as well. So I suppose my question would be, in terms of your own organisation, are you aware of any engagement from the department currently in terms of this proposal, this proposed mitigation, in terms of, you know, how they would move that forward, what their plans are for taking it forward? Are you in contact with the department in that sense?
We put a meeting request in with the Minister pretty much on day one that the Assembly was restored. The Minister has agreed to that, but we're yet to find a date for it. So we do look forward to bringing these points to him directly. As far as the Department's position, though, beyond that, I wouldn't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay, my other question is slightly more general in the sense of identifying who, and one of the big problems is carers very often don't self-identify. They're just simply doing what they have to do and what they do for their loved one. They don't identify as carers, therefore they don't reach out, nor no one reaches out to them with support. I'm aware of that also from my role in social work. I'm also aware from questions that I've asked previously that there's a huge disparity across the trust in terms of their register of who carers are. As an organisation, are you content that enough work has gone into developing an appropriate register of carers that allows that communication or support to be, even minimal as it may be at times, that even that level doesn't reach the ground? What's your take on that?
Well, as you correctly say, if you even look at the difference between the number of unpaid carers identified in the census, which is 220,000, versus carers allowance itself, much lower than that, what exists at the trust level, I think they're only reaching about 10 to 12% of those who care within their boundaries. So massive gaps in that data. I know trying to develop a regional carers register is part of the work of the Social Care Collaborative Forum within the Department of Health, who are looking at that, a co-chair work stream within that, which is trying to make progress there. But it's a difficult nut to crack, and at the moment we're just at the process of looking at options and trying to learn best practice from elsewhere. So there are plans to try and make progress on that for sure, and it could make a difference in a number of different areas, you know, including when it comes to information and maybe signposting to financial support, as you said.
Okay, thank you, Craig. I have Kelly, and then I'm going to Daniel. So Kelly, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I'll declare an interest as a member of the all-party group on carers, and was taken as vice chair yesterday. But I'm also a carer. I care for a family member, and the rest of you all get to go home. There's other things I need to do. Craig, thank you very much for your presentation. As a carer, I don't receive carers allowance, and I mainly cannot do that because I'm in paid employment. Just to put it on record, just for clarification, carers allowance is counted as income. So if somebody is on universal credit and they get carers allowance, basically it gets wiped out because it's counted as income. Can you just talk through how that works, just so we have it on record for the committee?
Yep, no, absolutely. Well, in the case of universal credit, as you said, if you receive universal credit and carers allowance at the same time, your UC payment will be reduced by the value of carers allowance. So as you said, it is a sore point for a lot of people that it does have that impact. Now at the same time, receiving carers allowance or having an underlying entitlement to it can open other doors within the welfare system. So within universal credit, for example, you'll get a carer premium as a result of receiving carers allowance. So on the whole, you may actually be less, ever so slightly better off. It's not a whole lot. But as you rightly say, carers allowance interacts with other benefits in a number of very complex ways, and overlapping benefit rules can close some doors and open others.
And that's one of the things I would like the committee to examine with the Minister, is whether or not we could have carers allowance even changed, that it's not counted towards income, to make that fair. But I just wanted to ask, Chair, my second question is about the recognition payment, which I absolutely agree with. And I would love to hear if you have any anecdotal evidence from Scotland that says how much this has helped carers by receiving the recognition payment.
Yeah. Well, just actually on the point just that you mentioned towards the last question there, as far as not counting this as income, certainly when it comes to the recognition payment, what they've done in Scotland is it's disregarded as income for other means tested benefits, and that's crucial actually if this is going to work. Otherwise you're going to end up with a lot of inadvertent impacts that made these people worse off. So that was delivered via a statutory instrument by the Department of Work and Pensions, for the Scottish Government as part of that process, and we would want to see that replicated here. Just in terms of the difference this has made in Scotland, as I mentioned earlier, the evaluations they have done so far suggest that it can help people to pay for essential bills that they couldn't otherwise, to take part in some social activities that they would have struggled to afford, do things with their children, to improve their mental health, to help them clear debts. It has been quite transformative for people. Now, as I said, we're well aware that the number of people lifted out of poverty as a result of delivering it here, it's not going to fix things for everyone. We're very conscious of that, but within the constraints that we're operating in with the department's time and resource restrictions at the moment, we think this is the most pragmatic approach to try and deliver something meaningful in Northern Ireland.
So it's a key part of the anti-poverty strategy that we should be looking at.
Well, I suppose how it's delivered, unpaid carers probably wouldn't care so much if it's done via that. It's going to require legislation, primary legislation, regardless, to implement that here the same way as other mitigation payments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Craig. I have to say this is one of the areas that is a key priority for me. There's huge challenges out there for unpaid carers, and really where there's very limited family connections, often it's left to one or two people, which is a real significant emotional strain, as well as on every aspect of their lives. The financial element is causing a huge amount of stress to a lot of unpaid carers, and you're right when you point out that it is saving the system billions of pounds. It actually angers me when I hear you put all these issues into one briefing, and it is something that needs to be dealt with, but it's entirely reflective of how this place mistreats those who step up and look after the most vulnerable in our society and our community. In relation to the £81.50 per week, which is an abysmal amount of money, and insulting actually, to be honest, has there been any conversation in relation to removing the restriction on earnings alongside that? So for instance, there's people that have businesses and have a fair amount of flexibility, but cannot be a carer, for instance, a paid carer. They don't do it for money, but it helps with costs and stuff like that. And then I suppose anyone really that wants to work a part-time job to make ends meet in order to ensure that they can afford to look after somebody. Has there been conversations with the department in relation to that? And why is there a reluctance actually to remove that income-related benefit?
I think the conversations within that area up to now, and if you look at the other recommendations and the mitigations review from 2022, it's about increasing the earnings cap as opposed to removing it entirely. I think removing it in its entirety would maybe not be the most targeted approach, versus increasing how many hours someone could work or how much they could earn before the carers allowance payment is removed. At the moment, it's a very small amount, £151 a week you can earn before your carers allowance stops. And unlike other parts of the social security system, there isn't any taper, for example. It's £151 and 1p you've earned in that week. Carers allowance disappears in its entirety. There's no sort of partial payment or anything of that nature. So certainly it would make a massive difference if we could increase that earnings cap to something that's more reflective of what people need just to get by. What we're suggesting is if you match that to 21 hours at the national living wage, that could let people earn a bit more and keep their carers allowance payment. Now, it certainly wouldn't be an excessive income by any means. We're not going to have carers lighting cigars with £50 notes if you happen to do that, but it would allow them to earn a little bit more than what they can at the minute. And the earnings cap very much, I think, is an example of the department having its cake and eating it, because it'll tell you that carers allowance isn't an income replacement, but then tie eligibility to it so strictly to what someone's income is. So certainly something has to give there for sure.
And do you see much movement in that regard? Is the department listening, or are you getting the same response as most people that, well, it all depends on our budget and our finances are tight? I think this is a priority area that really should have been resolved long before now. It's not a new problem.
Well, I suppose in the context of the wider mitigations review, it has been, you know, more sort of general answers from the minister when he's been asked in written questions or oral questions, that it'll be considered. It's my understanding the minister is going to formally respond to the review at some point, and maybe we'll get more of an insight there. But up to now, we're not sure.
And final question, Chair. Just I know that there's been references to and comparatives made to Scotland, but what other jurisdictions could we use as points of reference in relation to where this is done well? Have you looked at any?
I think in the across the border in the south, their main benefit for unpaid carers is also called carers allowance, but it's radically different in terms of how much it's worth and the eligibility for it. And by many accounts, it is much more generous.
Give some insight into what that is. Have you any information on that?
I don't have the numbers for that to hand, but can certainly come back to the committee on that. That's no problem. Now, the only sort of caveat, I suppose, whenever we speak to our sort of equivalent down there, which is an organisation called Family Carers Ireland, they would say, yes, that benefit is more generous, but people also lose out in other ways through the likes of having to pay for health and social care services as a carer that they maybe don't have to up here necessarily. And the impression they give is that it's that sort of context is why they're able to pay more through the welfare system. So I suppose there's pros and cons to it. But on the face of it, certainly the value of that in the south is much more generous than it is in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, and I too want to follow the Chair's remarks in terms of showing our deep appreciation to all of the unpaid carers out there that are struggling in providing absolute care and support to those who need it. It is hugely appreciated across the board. My own family members as well have benefited significantly from great sacrifices, and it is a sacrifice for a loved one, and saves our health service every single day from buckling under the pressure of what would happen if they weren't indeed doing that important role. So, and we appreciate you as a powerful voice and advocate for unpaid carers, and a lot of people are following the great work that you are doing and are in support of it, so keep going.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Ciara, and then Ciara, then Andy, then Sean, and then Brian.
Okay.
So people could now, there's a flurry now of interest, so I've been allocating time out, so people could be fairly succinct.
I'll try and be succinct, and thank you, Craig and Angela. And I will also declare that I am a member of the All-Party Group for Carers. And I have to say, first and foremost, to commend Carers NI and yourselves for the fantastic work that you're doing in raising and continuing to raise the needs and the challenges facing carers here. And I think we'll all definitely agree that they're the backbone of our health service. They're the backbone of families. And I know myself, and I think there's no family is not in need of care, and there's someone somewhere in your family that is providing that critical work. What I would ask, we're well aware, obviously, and very much supportive of reform of the carers allowance and the recognition payment. Obviously addressed with Westminster. Could you maybe enlighten us as to what discussions are happening in Westminster regarding the carers allowance at this moment in time, and where is it at, and what's the field of potential change at Westminster, because that's ultimately where it rests. Thank you.
It isn't great news by all accounts from over there. I think just yesterday, Wednesday, one of the DWP ministers was before the equivalent of this committee in the House of Commons and made clear that any idea of increasing the value of carers allowance isn't on the table. Obviously, there's a general election coming up, and what that will mean in the future, I don't know. But I suppose just to emphasise that, regardless of what happens over here, I would like to think there's an opportunity for this Assembly to lead the way. We have done it in the past with other mitigation measures. We could bring, if the Minister was so minded, legislation forward himself to deliver this in Northern Ireland, and that would be a nice, a rare, admittedly, example of this Assembly leading the way in an aspect of that. Scotland has done it already. They've shown what a difference it can make to people, and it would be great if the Department was willing to do that for carers in Northern Ireland too.
Just one other thing. Obviously, you mentioned 220,000 from a census perspective, and we will only have there's 48,000 obviously receiving carers allowance. So that's basically a 25% probably, if that's actually have some kind of payment that is supporting them to do their job. Although obviously it's not enough. I'm very keen to hear with regards to young carers, and they're probably within the census figures are probably a large percentage of young people. And I know as a young person myself at 16 I was a carer for an aunt and moved out of the family home and lived with her for a year and a half to provide that, and that's just through family. So I'd love to really just hear a wee bit more about young carers and the impact it's having on them.
Did you have your hand up to come in there?
Sorry?
Oh, I thought you wanted to come in there, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Well, young carers, obviously, those below 18, obviously has a significant impact on them. And you can only claim carers allowance if you're over 16. So there's a significant amount of young carers obviously providing lots of care in addition to trying to do their education without any recognition whatsoever. And often in families where money is very tight, and where there isn't money to enable them to do those extracurricular activities, to progress their education, to just have a day out in terms of a social life there.
So a recognition payment would go so far to protect all carers, but particularly our young carers.
Yeah, it's certainly it's different. As Angela said, a different set of issues. What really struck me when we speak to young carers about these sort of issues, is that so many of them have come to almost accept that life for them has to be smaller than for their peers. They just can't expect as much from life, as much from their education, as much from their social lives, because those pressures of poverty and caring combined just make that impossible. And it really is it's a sad indictment of the lack of support that they receive. So some sort of financial support there would make a difference. The Welfare Mitigations Review does recommend a young carer grant, which will be separate to the recognition payment, specifically to target those people. And of course, it goes without saying we're supportive of that. Although conscious, again, about that all of these things probably can't be delivered at the same time and within this mandate.
There's a significant number of young adult carers as well who are trying to enter the labour market, who are trying to get their first jobs and things. And the earnings threshold that we mentioned before, that £151 a week, is a significant barrier to carers entering, and remaining in the labour market. So we need to think around that as well. £151 a week that you're allowed to earn equates to about 13 hours at the national living wage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and actually the young carers issue really demonstrates the need for us to get to grips with this on a cross-departmental basis. I mean, there's clearly a role for communities, there's clearly a role for health, education and economy in terms of those young adults and students and all. There's cuts across so many and other areas as well. Okay, so going then to Andy, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be very brief because Ciara's already picked up on the main thrust of what I wanted to raise, and it was about the ultimate policy direction being set at Westminster, and obviously here in Northern Ireland we maintain parity. That would be the correct, wouldn't it, Craig?
Yeah, so to deliver the recognition payment would represent a breaking parity, as with previous mitigations. Yep.
Yeah, and in terms of that recognition payment, and I know we've got obviously Les, who was part of the panel, who are recommending that would be the more efficient way to do that, rather than us trying to mitigate to increase the weekly amount, for example.
I think it would be more straightforward to do so, yes, and cleaner and more easy to administer, I would imagine, so yeah.
Okay, and then just kind of pick up very quickly on, I know you'd said there's disappointing vibes coming out from Westminster and UK government, but what has your interaction been with them as an organisation? Have you found that your voice is being heard?
So we're part of a UK-wide setup. So there's an equivalent to our team in England who seeks to engage with the Westminster government regularly. I suppose it's a very crowded field over there. There's obviously a lot going on, and seemingly government priorities over there wouldn't seem to be focusing overly on some of these issues. You know, social security reform as a whole is the sense that I get. You know, never mind the sort of small part of that that's for carers. So it definitely isn't encouraging, and I suppose that's why we've said it would. I think if we're waiting for Westminster to do this for us, we could be waiting an awfully long time, and carers don't really have that time.
No, absolutely, and I appreciate that, and ultimately it will be at the will of committee colleagues, but I'm sure it wouldn't do any harm if we were to write to the DWP in UK government just to highlight our support for movement from a UK-wide basis on this issue. And just finally, in terms of, obviously, hopefully we can see movement on the recognition payment and other aspects of the welfare mitigations independent review recommendations. Are there any other specific areas you would like to see movement on across the Northern Ireland government here?
Well, I think within the welfare system, we're trying to be sort of super pragmatic and focus on what's achievable and affordable. So within DFC's brief, I think that recognition payment is the main game in town for us. You know, I suppose I don't see it's getting very far if we come up with a long list of very expensive measures within the welfare system and to have all that thrown out as opposed to pursuing a sort of targeted approach. Very well aware, you know, as I said, that this isn't going to fix everything for everyone, but it will make a difference. You know, thousands of carers left out of poverty immediately as a result of doing this.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Andy. Sean?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think most of what I'd wanted to ask has been covered, but thank you, Craig and Angela. In terms of Social Security Scotland having put in place this recognition payment, do we know how much it costs them to receive that data on a biannual basis from DWP?
They so I tried my very best to look into that, but the sort of documentation that's published for it, that aspect is redacted, so they don't publish that. It's not made public. I'm not sure if the Scottish Government will be willing to tell the committee if it asked. I don't know, but it's not publicly available information, I'm afraid.
If it would be possible, Chair, even if we write, I think it'd be really that's a key element. I think that we would need to know.
Yeah, and I suppose just because I appreciate, you know, those sort of administrative costs will be a concern for the Assembly. Maybe the one thing to highlight, you know, one of the founding principles of the review as a whole, you know, which recommended this, which was to not come up with proposals that would have an excessive cost for administration and IT. So while we don't know the total figure, we would be relatively confident that it won't be excessive, you know, within that sort of context.
No, thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean and Brian.
Okay, look, thank you for the information and highlighting all these issues. And there's several aspects to Carers Alliance, as you say, that are very problematic for people. The low rate that it's paid and the cliff edge and the fact of it counting as income for other benefits. So these are all issues that need to be looked at, you know, and welcome your report that you've highlighted these. I just want to ask about the Carers Alliance recognition payment as it's paid in Scotland. You're saying that it doesn't count as income, so that's one of the difference. Are there other criteria? Is it still means tested? Does it only go to people who are eligible for Carers Alliance then? Yeah. So there's still a cut-off, is that right?
Yeah. So
in terms of income?
Yeah, it's available to those who are already in receipt of Carers Allowance, so they don't even have to apply for it. It's automatically paid to them. But the eligibility criteria is the same. Yeah.
And it's funded by the Scottish Government from their own taxation. There's it's not covered from Westminster. And I think you've said in your report it would cost around 26 million in Northern Ireland to provide that, so that would come out of our own block grant then. We wouldn't get that through the Social Security budget. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And I want to thank both Craig and Angela there for your presentation this morning. I know it's been a quick run through, but we do have other related briefings in relation to the general area, so we're trying to look into all those mitigations in more detail. But I want to wish you well, and Craig and Angela, in the ongoing work you do with a sector that I think we absolutely need to do better by and do better for. And that's a key priority, I think, for all of us. I think that's come across clearly from committee here this morning. So thank you for that. Thank you. You can go ahead, and I'll speak to you again soon, I hope. So members, there's two proposals there. One to write to the Department of Work and Pensions. Members agreed with that in relation to work on carers allowance, and then the Scottish figures that Sean proposed. Anything else, members, that want
I just
to?
clarify, when we're writing to, as Andy has said, to the Department of Work and Pensions, can we ask them what work they are doing to have a disregard for carers allowance against means tested benefits?
Yeah. Members content with that? Yeah. Any other questions arising, members, or content to move on to our next briefing? Yep. So we'll move on then, and thank you. We're moving on to item 6 on our agenda, and this is a briefing on the independent review of welfare mitigations and impact on carers. Members, the briefing paper is at page 125, and I now like to welcome the following representatives to the meeting this morning: Liam Devine, CEO of Clanray Group, and Les Allenby, Chairperson of the Welfare Mitigations Review Independent Advisory Panel. So I think it's yourself, Liam, that we're going to go back to for a brief presentation. But I'd like to welcome both of you to the meeting this morning, and really looking forward to the session to look into the important work that you've already completed and where that sits and how we move forward with all of that.
Thanks, Chair. I think Liam and I decided to do the double-hander with me doing a brief overview and then Liam talking about the work of the organisation and how it fits in with the review, if that's okay with the committee. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation, and welcome the opportunity to address the committee on the work of the independent panel to review social security mitigations. We were given the task by the then Minister Deirdre Hargey, and we were given really two tasks. First, to review the existing mitigations that were agreed in 2016, and that included not implementing the social size criteria, or to use the shorthand, the bedroom tax, and secondly, not to implement the benefit cap for families. And then second, we were asked to make recommendations of the need for any additional mitigations to cover then 3 financial years, 2022-23, through until this financial year, 2024-25. And in particular, we were asked to consider the impact of the reforms on a number of categories, including household income, disability, gender, among others. And the key message that I want to give today is that our recommendations have 3 virtues. First, they're fully costed, so the department knows what the spend is, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, that they are effectively targeted on people in the lowest incomes. And then third, we recommended building in a communications approach to ensure that the people who benefited from the mitigations know that it's a result of the devolved government. I think one of the weaknesses of the first mitigations package was it made quite an impact, but people didn't actually understand that it was because of decisions taken here rather than across the Irish Sea. In terms of ensuring that this was effectively targeted on the lowest household incomes, we did it by engaging Landman Economics and also working with the Department for Community's own now Analytics Division. And Landman Economics has a tax transfer model which provides aggregate costings for any policy option, including the mitigations, and it can do it by what I call income decile. In other words, how much will the top 10% benefit right through down to the bottom 10%. So we can really look at how focused it is. We could also do it by disability, by gender, and by a number of other categories. Our purpose was to recognise that working age families had borne the brunt of the changes to social security and tax from 2010 to 2020. And we wanted to focus both on those who are in work and out of work. And that was because, first of all, the withdrawal of the £20 uplift, which all 5 parties had wanted not to happen, was partially compensated by changes to tapers and earnings allowances within universal credit, but that only helped people in work. It didn't help those out of work. But also there was a recognition that we have a lot of in-work poverty. It's something that Liam will comment on. And we also were aware that the two-child policy impacts on people who are in work as well as people who are out of work. So working age households and families was part of our target. And also we wanted to make sure, and we had a hypothesis that if you reached those who are in the lowest third of household incomes, then you would capture effectively those households that also had an adult or a child with a disability, carers and women, and that proved to be the case. And that's really for very obvious reasons, in the sense that if you're a lone parent, you're likely to be a woman. It's harder to find well-paid work and full-time work. If you have a disability, you're less likely to be in work, etc. So one difference between this review and the first review was we didn't have a budget, because in the first mitigations review, the Northern Ireland Executive agreed to set aside 585 million for 4 years up until 2020 to cover the mitigations, and that included incorporating the discretionary support scheme. So we had no guaranteed budget, but we worked on the premise that we would produce a package that was broadly commensurate with that annual spend, because we knew that we almost had a precedent that that money could be found where there was a political will for social security mitigations. So we decided to stay roughly within that funding envelope. Briefly then, and you have our briefing paper, but the recommendations included offsetting the two-child limit in universal credit, child tax credit and housing benefit only claims, and that was through a welfare supplementary payment called the Better Start Larger Families Grant. If you remember, the original rationale for the two-child policy was that it would influence people to reduce the number of children that they had, even if that is a sound principle, and personally I don't think it is. It was blown out of the water by the pandemic, when large numbers of people who hitherto were in reasonably paid work lost their work, perhaps have gone back into work but not as well paid, or had struggled to find work again and found themselves caught by the two-child policy. We also know that circumstances in life, ill health in a family, suddenly an increase in caring responsibilities, you could find yourself going from well-paid work to low-paid work or no work at all, and the two-child policy kicked in. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, in a piece of research it had done in 2018, had said that child poverty and its projected increases is largely an increase in larger families. So what the two-child policy and mitigating it would do would be to put a handbrake on the increase in child poverty. And we think, therefore, that that was one of our key recommendations. The second was to introduce a Better Start grant payment, and that's providing extra support for people on benefits, certain benefits tied to specific child development goals. So at birth, when you start nursery school, primary school, the transition from secondary to level education, and staying on at 16. The third one, which Liam will say something about, is the cost of work allowance, and this was to provide an annual payment to people who were on low pay. It was to be both for those who have children, those without children, and an additional payment for people with disabilities. And in part, that was a recognition that outside of the social security system, we provide much less childcare support in Northern Ireland than in the rest of the United Kingdom. A carers recognition payment that I would be very surprised if you didn't hear about it in the previous submission, but a number of things for carers, the recognition payment, a young carers grant, and some greater flexibility around the earnings rule to allow carers in part-time work to stay in work and care at the same time. Augmenting additional support for winter fuel costs aimed both at older people but also at households with a young child or a child with a disability at home, and that was to augment the existing schemes. assistance for those caught by the shortfall in private rented sector through the local housing allowance. Almost everybody now faces a shortfall, and that has to be made up from their ordinary benefit. We costed doing something about that. We felt that was unaffordable in terms of the Northern Ireland Executive, but we came up with some proposals to implement a financial inclusion service with access to some grant aid so that it would assist with people who were caught up with possibly losing their homes because they couldn't make up the shortfall in the rent. The 5-week rule, and we came up there with a recommendation about interim solution, which was to increase the payments in the Universal Credit Contingency Fund, but then some longer term work. And the 5-week rule, we had a very interesting engagement with UCRS, people who are on Universal Credit, who had some quite positive things to say about Universal Credit. But the one big area they were concerned about was the transition from whatever your circumstances were to getting onto Universal Credit was really problematic. Maintaining existing funding of mitigation additional funds for advice services. And we also wanted to ring fence some money for rural advice initiatives. We received a lot of evidence about how difficult things are for people who live in rural areas. The cost of living was higher. We struggled to see how you could deal with that in the social security system, but we felt that there were other ways through advice services that you could do something positive for those who lived in rural areas. And then finally, maintaining the key mitigations from the first review, particularly the bedroom tax, and addressing the benefit cap should be maintained. And we had one particular recommendation about the transition from young people from DLA to PIP when aged 16. Scotland has done something about that by changing that to the aged 18, and we came up with some recommendations to deal with that. The costings are in your briefing paper. This year, when we did this, were around 150 million a year. We think they were robust at that time because we worked very closely with both the department and Landman Economics, but they were always based on forecasting. Since the report, I've met with both the Permanent Secretary and the Minister, Gordon Lyons. We've had a good engagement. I'd asked the department to update the costings, both from Landman Economics and the department, and I understand that's been done. And I noticed, for example, a figure in the debate about the two-child policy the other day, and our figure for this year of 52.9 million had been updated by the department to 56.4 million. So it suggests that the department has done some of that work. I think it would be very useful for the committee to get that kind of detail from the department. It's worth saying, before I conclude, that there are also a statutory required review of the first mitigations package, and that must take place, it seems to me, sooner rather than later, because the first mitigations package, not our one, but the first one, ends on the 31st of March 2025, and then a separate but not statutory response, I understand, is being prepared by officials from the department to our report. So you'll hopefully have an opportunity to look at what the department's response is to that. And my conclusion is just to say, remind the committee that the High Court had held that the then Northern Ireland Executive, who had responsibility for an anti-poverty strategy, had breached the law in 2015 by not having a strategy. It's now with the Department for Communities. And it's 9 years on, and we still don't have that strategy. We either have to be serious about tackling child poverty and adult poverty or not. And our mitigations recommendations are costed, well targeted, and along with a need for a programmatic response, could be considered the foundation stone of any anti-poverty strategy. So I'll stop there and then maybe ask Liam to say something about the practical stuff on the ground.
Liam, you made a bad mistake letting Les go first. He's eating into all your time. I really do want to get the members, so as succinct as possible, or even if you wanted to send us something back in writing for information, if that helps you to get
I'll
through.
try and keep it as brief if that's okay. So thank you very much, members, for hearing from me. Clanrye Group, a voluntary and community organisation in operation for over 40 years, 165 staff, and right throughout Northern Ireland. I joined the mitigations panel as opposed just to take a look at particularly the barriers to people returning to work. And you'll see some of the results of the barriers for people returning to work in the recommendations of the paper, particularly the cost of returning to work, the fear of the loss of benefits and affecting people not returning to work, and the active discouragement in some way, shape or form from people returning to work because of the peculiarities of the system and particular to universal credit. In looking at the cost of returning to work, zeros our contract, working line months, job security, the clunky UC system, those things are all mitigated against people returning to work. For me, and in the 35 years that I've been involved in this, the fear of loss of benefits is the one major deciding factor on whether people return to work or not, because the fear of losing those benefits have a significant impact both mentally and economically on that. Having a backup in terms of what we've suggested in terms of this programme, I think in terms of having a 6-month stay in relation to losing those benefits would have a significant impact on the number of people that we could get into employment as a result. The other thing is, I would say, is that the peculiarities of the system. You know, one of our people who has had carers allowance, she had some mental health difficulties. She decided to take up a job as a lollipop lady. She works 15 hours a week in Armagh, and as a result she has lost all her carers allowance because she was £1 or £2 over the rate in which she could apply. And that to me doesn't seem fair, practical, or the best solution to some of the intractable problems that we have. I'll finish there because I know it's been. But all I would just say is that I would recommend the recommendations as outlined by Les, and they were very thoroughly, as almost researched and thought through, and it would make a significant impact to the communities that we serve. Thank you
very much. Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge the work that you did in very difficult circumstances, given that there was no budget. I think it was an important piece of work that Deirdre Hargey sought, and it has transpired into a very kind of practical and clear set of recommendations, and I want to thank you for that. And I suppose that in recognition that you did, that they were brought forward at a time when you didn't have a budget or whatever, and I know you've already prioritised what financial support could have the greatest impact. But given the current budgetary challenge, is there any particular one that you would highlight as being a top or an immediate priority in terms of at this minute in time?
It's funny you should ask me that. It's the question I get asked by officials, and so I have two candid answers. The first is it's a package, and it is about recognising where you can get the most bang for your buck as a package. Having said that, if you were to ask me, are there 3 areas that I would focus particularly on, but not at the expense of others, it's the 2-child policy is the first. You lose over £62 a week per child as a result. We wouldn't dream of saying we'll only allow you to educate your first 2 children, we'll only treat your first 2 children in health, yet we say we'll only give you financial assistance for your first 2 children in social security. If you think back to the extra cost of living payments that went to households on low incomes during the what I call a low income crisis rather than the cost of living crisis, then those payments did not compensate the loss of the 2 child, even having a 3rd child and not getting paid in universal credit towards that. So that's the first. The second would be the Better Start grant payment. The Northern Ireland Programme for Government talks about giving children and young people the best start in life. the amount that you get for maternity needs has not increased in a decade. We took away, I say we, the then government in 2010 took away in 2011 the health and pregnancy grant. It reduced the extra money you got in child tax credit in the first year of a child's life. And we confined help with maternity needs to a first child. So doing something around those child milestones and building in the idea that you tie that to child development would be the second. And I think the third is around the carers' payments. We talked to carers extensively. We know that from Carers NI, the saving in Northern Ireland for care is 4.6 billion a year. Now, nobody says that everybody's going to stop caring, and that's what it would cost to replace that care. Our recommendation for a carer's payment was something like 25.7 million a year. So if you compare the 4 billion with the 25 million, it doesn't deal with the issues. But what carers said to us is they wanted some kind of genuine recognition. And there were other practical parts of that, including addressing the example that Liam gave about the lollipop lady. But I would emphasise that this is a package as a whole. There are other areas in the social security system that Northern Ireland can do something about in a way that I think is financially manageable. We did it in 2016. There's no reason if we had the political will we couldn't do it in 2024.
Could I add the fear of taking away the fear of the loss of benefits would have a significant impact both on getting people to return to work, keeping people in work and getting rid of that fear factor. So it would make organisations like our own have a significant advantage in trying and fill the very many skills and jobs that are actually available in our local economies at the minute.
Yep, thank you. And then finally for me, before we go to members, for either of you, is in relation to, and we're very conscious now of just how wide the gaps have become within what is supposed to be a social security system. You mentioned 2010, Les, and I think we're really at the sharp end of a decade, well over a decade now of austerity, and I think a useful reference from you there in terms of an income crisis as well as a cost of. I think that's relevant. So, what assessment would you have in terms of the costs, and they will be real costs, of not doing the mitigations?
Well, we know that it's very hard to cost the cost of not doing something, but what we do know is that poverty has an impact on budgets elsewhere. If you grow up in poverty, your health will be poorer. That puts more pressure on the health service. If you grow up poor, your educational outcomes are affected. That then impacts you're more likely to end up in the social security system than you would otherwise. I've always looked at this a bit like it's a bit like a race. And some people start from birth in lane 8 and some people start in lane 1. But actually what the state does at times is doesn't just put somebody who ends up in lane 8. They tie the shoelaces together of that person in lane 8. And it has all kinds of costs and consequences. And this is not the answer to all of those things, but it is a start. And why I think this is important, you've got the figures for poverty in Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, and they are slightly better in Scotland and Northern Ireland and England and Wales, and they are slightly better, not entirely, it's a bit more nuanced than this, but the mitigations or the augmenting of social security in Scotland and the augmenting of social security in Northern Ireland plays a role in that. So we can play a role in reducing poverty, and that does have important knock-on consequences, including if the programme for government, which I always agreed with, giving children and young people the best start in life. Again, if we're serious about that, then these are the kind of things we need to be doing.
Could I add, just on a practical level, we operate a social supermarket in Newry Morning Down. And in our last programme, we advertised on a Sunday at 12 noon for people to join the social supermarket. We had 250 people by 7 a.m. on Monday morning. who had registered their interest. The vast majority of those were people who were already in jobs, and they were the working poor, and rent and the inability to survive on their working wage was the major problem.
Yep,
And that's the practical outgoings of where we're at.
Thank you, Liam. Sian, go ahead.
I'm just concerned, Chair, that you have read all my questions. No, thank you so much to both of you. Liz, I think yours was the Bible when I was starting to look at this when I took on this remit. So I just want to thank you for the work that you've done. In terms of looking forward and trying to put together an anti-poverty strategy as the department's doing, can you give us a bit of a sense of what you would see as success indicators? Because poverty is so overreaching, you've said there has an impact on all budgets, and will have a view down the line. What would you think what key performance indicators would you put into an anti-poverty strategy that would say that we're doing this right?
Yeah, one of the criticisms of the recent Northern Ireland Audit Office report about poverty was that the indicators were really vague. I actually think we do have some indicators, and I think you take a holistic approach. So we have figures on absolute and relative poverty. There's work done by Joseph Rowntree and others about the number of people who are destitute. So there are a range of ways in which you can measure poverty. And I think what we should have are aims that say very clearly the numbers and percentages should be being reduced, and we should set figures for the numbers that should be reduced. And that's your starting point. What tends to happen, and what I think the Northern Ireland Audit Office report highlighted, is everything that is being done by government departments is thrown in as almost anti-poverty measures, but there isn't actually a set of targets to reduce the numbers, and the numbers are frightening. Even if you take the two-child policy on its own, our proposals would have impacted around 19,000 households. I suspect the increase from the 52.9 to the 56.4 million from our forecasts suggests that the numbers caught by the two-child policy have probably gone up slightly. But they're commensurate with the costings, and the department will cost each of these individually. So I think it's about recognising the various measures of poverty. The Social Mobility Commission have done some interesting work around how you measure poverty. And again, I think we should consider adopting that. And my other thing about this is some of this is income maintenance. Remember, between 2010, there was 3 years when benefits were means-tested benefits were frozen. They were only increased by 1%, I think, for 2 years. During when inflation went up to 11%, benefits, because of the way they are set around the consumer price index, only went up that year by 3.1%, when inflation started the financial year at that same time at 9% and went up to 11%. So benefit levels, which the reality is we can't do anything about those within the executive, but you can see why people are struggling and going to social supermarkets. So it's about that on the one hand, but a programmatic response, which was not what our review was about. Some of the other strategies that the department have, it's about doing both of those things. It's not one at the expense of the other. It must be both.
And just finally, I know that you've already met with the Minister. Were there any indications from the Minister about any of these recommendations, or any that he would be more minded to put in place, if you were able to say?
No, in fairness, he didn't indicate, but what he said was he'd asked officials to do some work on this. He knew that the costings, kind of up-to-date costings, were being done, and he would want to see what those were. And of course, he quite rightly said, it might change today. I don't have a budget at the moment, so it'd be very difficult for me to offer kind of, a series of kind of commitments until I see what my budget is. And I have to say that's fair enough. But as I've said before, in some ways, this is not just about the FC. I mean, our recommendations would need legislation. It would need to come to the Northern Ireland Executive. This is an issue for all of the parties rather than just one minister. Clearly, it comes from the budget of one minister, but it's a Northern Ireland Executive commitment rather than just a DFC commitment.
Thanks, Les.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Les and Liam, for your presentation, and very detailed presentation at that. A lot of work went into that. When we looked over the submission, you were essentially seeking to support the poorest, if I'm right, the poorest 1/3 of the population within the given categories of gender, disability, household income, particular reference to households with children. That said, you used a model that assessed impact from the bottom 10% to the top 10%. So do these recommendations support the poorest 10% better than the next poorest 10% and so on? Is that how that works?
Yeah, it does. Interestingly, and the reason we looked at the bottom third of household incomes is over time, the analysis was those in the bottom 10% were slightly better off over the decade 2010 to 2020. There was some work done by the Human Rights Commission. That was partly because the take-up of universal credit is better than the take-up of the 6 individual benefits there were before. But that group have still lost out over the 10-year period. But actually, it's people just above that. So in the next 10%, those who live in the lowest 10 to 20%, 20 to 30% have done particularly badly, while interestingly, those in the top 10% were slightly worse off in the decade from 2010 to 2020, and that was to do with occupational pensions and tax. But actually, the next group, who again are what I'll call the very comfortably off, had not actually been badly affected at all by austerity and tax and social security measures. So we really picked the bottom third because it was about recognising, for example, in-work poverty as well as poverty for those who are out of work. And it's Liam's work with those who are in work and trying to get people into work. He knows from his work that being in work of itself is not the end of the start. It's the start of kind of a stepping stone towards getting out of poverty. So that's why we were concentrating in the lowest third, 40%, because you have to look at that group as a whole.
I appreciate that answer. Much of the evidence that we've received since this Assembly has returned has pointed to the challenges faced by working people, and obviously childcare is a key factor in relation to that, that's pushing people into difficulty as well and making challenging decisions. The working people are struggling very much at the minute, and certainly something that I'm hearing on a daily basis in my own constituency. You propose 500,000 a year to be set aside for advice service initiatives focused on rural areas. What particular issues do you see in rural areas that require this?
I'll maybe cover it then. Again, Liam, I know we'll talk about the practicalities of this. So the issues that were coming up with us, and we went and met groups, rural groups, were we don't have a supermarket round the corner, so it's not so our shopping bill could be higher. We have to travel to places, even if it's to go to a local social security office, it's not going to be close by. If we want to travel to other facilities, the bus service may not be as frequent, particularly if you have to turn up at an appointment at a specific time. And therefore, so the cost of living, the impact of costs of living in a rural area can be significantly greater than in an urban area. Doing something about that in the social security system is really difficult. You can't start to say, if you live in, somewhere out in Fermanagh, West Fermanagh, you should somehow get more benefit than you live in North Belfast. So what we thought was at least things like take-up of benefit, perhaps initiatives about how, helping people kind of in an online basis to, and other kinds of initiatives would improve take-up and do other things. And so ring fencing some additional work for the advice services to do those kind of initiatives was the most practical thing that we could think of. But I suspect some of the other things will have to be a programmatic response.
Yeah, it is an interesting area that you're probing into, and particularly rural communities over the last decade have come under attack and removal of services, be it health services, financial services. Schools have been closing. There's been a huge amount of challenges for rural dwellers, and certainly in my own constituency, shared by two colleagues across the table there, they will recognise that it is an acute challenge for significant sections of our constituency that is worsening because the view of, or the direction of government and large organisations and businesses more targeted towards urban centres as opposed to rural communities, and in effect you're going to have people moving from rural communities and moving to more urban centres, which is having a disproportionate impact. So it is something I would like to see more work done on, because there is an acute issue there that really needs to be highlighted.
Thank you. Kelly?
Thank you very much. I will be very, very quick on this one because
Thank you,
everybody has
Kelly.
asked the questions. You know, Les and Liam fangirling here all over the place. The other day there was a debate in the chamber, and I think it was Mr Kingston that actually asked the Minister if he could confirm the amount of money, and there was talk of 700 million, and my mind went, where did that come from? Because when I look at the figures that have been produced there, even with an inflationary rate over 2 years, I can't understand how 700 million has come to. In your discussions with the Minister, was it explained then what the 700 million was?
I don't know where the 700 million figure comes from either. No, I've had no discussions with the Minister. Whether the 700 million is over 3 or 4 years, which might be commensurate with this, but to be candid, I don't know where the 700 million comes from. And the one figure, if you like, for, which I mentioned earlier, the two-child policy, which I think the Minister in his reply said was now 56.4 million. Mm-hmm. Our forecast 3 years ahead of time was to be 52.9. So that suggests a small increase. Now, even if all the other proposals have that kind of commensurate increase, it's not taking you to 700 million. So unless that's a multi-year, I'm not sure on what basis the 700 million figure. But no doubt that's one for the Communities Committee to delve into.
To be honest, Les, if you don't know, it's unlikely we will ever know. So maybe that's something we could write to the Minister just to ask for clarification. As you say, it may be a multiple of years.
Yeah, I think we should see. I was surprised the figure too, I have to say. Brian?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your presentation and for your succinct report. I think it's a very good summary. I'm sure you have a longer document, and but this is very helpful. I welcome that you've met with the Minister and put these matters to him. Certainly, we would always feel that it's a complicated system, benefit system, and it must always provide incentive for people to get into work primarily through carrot. If you work, you'll be better off, you'll have a higher standard of living, and we should all be encouraged to advance ourselves and as a means of self-improvement towards reducing poverty, and it's helpful where you've highlighted circumstances, as we heard earlier, that are not providing that incentive for people and are actually a disincentive for people earning more, increasing their hours. So that's very important. Equally, you've highlighted the working poor, that with the cost of living crisis, prices went up so suddenly. People
I'll have to rush you through the question, Brian.
So the main point I would have about initiatives that will provide that incentive for people to get into work. You talked about reducing the fear of loss of benefits and the consequences of that. What would you say in terms of, and I think this overlaps with the work of the Department for Economy, but we do have responsibility for economic inactivity and helping people into employment. What would you say is the main assistance to encouraging and assisting people to go into work and advance themselves?
Well, I suppose for us, I suppose we have developed a holistic style of looking after individuals' needs, because each individual doesn't come with a particular set of employment needs or personal development needs or whatever. We need to deal with the person and their totality, and should that be anything from counselling to addiction services to training or employment, or should it be anything in terms of essential skills like English, Maths, ICT or whatever else. But also most important then as well is in terms of actually upskilling people, but also making sure that people have the necessary supports to allow them to actually progress and back into employment. The problem is that there's the trap, Brian, and that trap really exists where people who are on and have maybe spent many years on a particular type of benefit, and that fear of losing that benefit, never to have it returned, is a significant issue. And all those barriers combined make it more difficult than less for people to actually go back into the world of work. just having that mitigation in terms of a 6-month stay would have a significant and potentially fairly large impact on the over 10,000 clients that we deal with on an annual basis. If we multiply that throughout Northern Ireland, that's a significant number of people.
Okay. Brian, very quickly, there was several proposals that we had, as well as the being able to try work and get back onto benefit. Yeah. So the cushion of saying there's and you were quite right, it's about carrots rather than sticks, and it says if you try work and it doesn't work out, okay, then you don't have to wait 5 weeks again to get back onto benefit. That's the kind of fear factor. The social security system has improved incrementally around that, but there's still work I think can be done. The cost of work allowance was about a recognition that if you get into work, you'll get a payment at least once a year. The report sets out, we have the same help with childcare across the social security system. Yep. Outside of social security and childcare, Northern Ireland is miles behind the rest of the UK. So this is in part a recognition of that. We have a job grant, only 900,000 to $1 million a year for young people aged 18 to 24 that would give a payment if you got into work as a young person. So there are a number of incentives that are about getting people into work, because we recognise that while in-work poverty is an issue, it is a route out of poverty, but it's not in work. Getting into work is not an end in itself for poverty, it's a start.
Okay, thank you. Ciara, go ahead.
And I'll be very quick because I'm conscious of time, and thank you, Les and Liam, and it was absolutely fantastic to actually meet with you throughout the process of the report. Excellent report, and I think particularly, as you says, we're not just the 10%, but actually looking at those out of work, those in work, basically really detailed report. So just on that, regarding the data and and obviously the modelling that took place, that should be taking place on a continuous basis. Mm-hmm. So what was the challenges, and what improvements could be made so that information, the data is there, so we can have state-of-the-art information on a regular basis at hand to know exactly the situation, given the fact that the social security system is increasing, making worse. What it should be doing is supporting people, get them into work, out of poverty, but it's actually getting worse. So data is critical in that
it is
side of stuff.
During my time at the Human Rights Commission, we actually commissioned Landman Economics to do some work. And we sat down with the department, with the Landman Economics and the two researchers, took the department's own analytical division staff through the modelling. Because when I was at the commission, what we wanted to do was to do some work and be able to at least say that the department had understood the work, understood the modelling, and that it was robust, so that if we produced something, those would have been the conclusions of the Human Rights Commission. They wouldn't have been the department's conclusions, but at least everybody would accept that the data was sound. And I think we did that, which is why this review also used Landman Economics, because the department understands and has at least recognises the legitimacy of the data that's been produced. So I think that's really important. It goes further than some of the figures and etc. that the Treasury in Britain produces. So I have no shares in Landman Economics or no interest in Landman Economics, but I would suggest utilising them. But part of that was to make sure that our figures were legitimate. So at the end of the day, this is an independent report. So the figures and the conclusions, and some of the figures are the department's own figures, but the Landman Economic ones are ones that we've produced. They're not the department's. But my understanding is that the department recognises the legitimacy of the data. What I didn't want was to produce a report and then have a fight about saying, no, your underlying assumptions are all incorrect. So we really put a lot of time and energy into sitting down with the department's own folk to say, this is the modelling, this is the underlying basis on which we're producing the data, so that at least the data is considered to be robust within the department, recognising there's still conclusions of an independent review, they're not the department's conclusions.
Would you be confident that the department would have the confidence, the resources to continue that type of analysis?
Well, I mean, as ever, they'd have to no doubt pay Landman Economics to do that work, and so I have no idea what that would cost. The one thing that gives me a bit of comfort is when I asked the Permanent Secretary, for example, could you update the costings, including engaging Landman Economics again to do some more work on this alongside your own staff? The Permanent Secretary was open to doing that, and that suggests that if they didn't have confidence in Landman Economics and its work, they clearly wouldn't have done that. So I think the fact that they were prepared to get our costings updated suggests that they have some confidence, at least in that underlying work that's been done and that tax transfer model. And I say again that the conclusions are ours, not the department's. But I wanted to make sure we didn't go off down a cul-de-sac of no, your figures are way out of kilter.
Okay, thank you, members. So we'll have to move on. Just to wrap that up. So we have a proposal there for to write to the minister for to set out that 700 million figure where it's coming. Anything else?
Can we also ask with that to get the updated figures if they are there?
The numbers. Ask those updated figures, yeah. So Liam, we can say cheerio and good luck to yourself. I know, Les, you're very kindly staying on for the second.
I'll leave it in Gráinne's safe hands, but I'll sit behind. And
I think also now you've asked for someone to bring Gráinne in there.
Thank you.
So we're moving into item 7, members, and this is our session on the independent review of discretionary support. So I want to welcome to joining Les. I thought Les was Les. I think you're staying.
He's had enough of us.
You're okay. Okay, well that's
needs be basis.
That's also fine. Is total confidence in you, Gráinne, and I'm sure that's not a bit misplaced either. So we welcome Professor Gráinne McKeever, Chair of the Independent Review of Discretionary Support. So Gráinne, could you go ahead, please, and make a brief opening statement, 5 minutes if you can manage that, and then we'll get to questions.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I won't go into detail about the context of the review and what we found. I think that's hopefully covered in the briefing paper, but I did want to focus on some of the recommendations to explain our thinking about them. The recommendations come within the context of our view that the social security and employment systems should provide an adequate standard of living, but those systems are failing. So as we've heard from the previous session, there are difficulties with those systems meeting the basic income needs of individuals. And we think that the systems that should provide dignity and respect for individuals have to be enabled to do that. So while we looked at discretionary support and how it was working, we looked at it through that framework of protecting human dignity, and that meant that discretionary support as it's available should be fairly reliable, should be fairly dependent. It shouldn't be a lottery system or a charity system. The claimants should be able to trust that they would be able to get access for financial support for their essential crisis emergency needs. And those crisis and emergency needs were, really quite profound. When claimants spoke to us, they were talking about living in destitution, so not able to afford things like food, clothing, heating, lighting, and that's how we would define destitution. So we're talking about people who are really, really struggling. And so therefore our policy recommendations were based around how would we reach those people who were struggling the most. And there are a couple of things that I wanted to draw your attention to in our recommendations. The first is on the loans versus grant issue. So the principled argument is that there ought not to be loans within a system, because what you're doing is reclaiming money from people who are destitute and asking them to pay money back into a fund so that other destitute people can access that fund. That's a really strong principled argument. That's one that the review panel was very clear about. The difficulty is what that does to the loan landscape in Northern Ireland. As we know, there are problems in Northern Ireland with illegal and paramilitary lending. We know that DS is not preventing people from getting access to high cost doorstep lending. So we know that DS will never alleviate those problems, but if it is not there as a loan system, an interest-free loan system, we were concerned about what that might do to the availability of resources for people in dire circumstances who would otherwise go somewhere else. The economic argument for loans is that they are fairly self-sustaining. So at the moment, when we looked at the report, it was 20p he returned £1 of loan recovery, so 20 pence expenditure led to £1 of loan recovery. So that was, a good system. It wasn't unduly expensive to recover loans. So while that remains the case, then there is an economic argument that loans should be sustained. Having said that, we did decide within the budget that we were looking at that the grant loan ratio could be flipped. So instead of 3 loans and 1 grant, you would have 3 grants and 1 loan. So our thinking on that was based on the £16 million budget that had been in place from the start of the DS scheme until we were looking at the review. And during that time period, the £16 million budget had never really been fully breached. So there was underspend within that budget year on year. The department had never had to exercise its power to put a brake on the budget because there was no danger of the budget being overspent. And so it looked like there was room within the budget to increase the level of grant allowance. After our review completed, and we trailed this in the review itself, the £20 uplift that had come from the Universal Credit awards during COVID that the UK government had made and had been implemented in Northern Ireland came to an end. So that came to an end towards the end of 21. And that created a lot of financial difficulties for people who had been relying on that extra £20. There had been a £6 million budget that was then changed for Universal Credit that was then transferred to a £500,000 budget for Household Support Fund, and that difference was obviously going to, be a stretch to match that. And then at the same time as we saw the increased cost of living or income crisis, as Les has called it, that put people's budgets under extreme pressure, and so there was a spike in demand for DS grants after the report finalised. That means that there was a particularly poor budget in place for what was needed. To the department's credit, it did increase the budget and it did meet demand to the extent that it could. Having said that, the demand does look like it's gone down. So it seems to have reduced by 20% in current circumstances. So it may be that there is more stability coming back into that. And so I don't underestimate the difficulty of making predictions on what a 3 grant, 1 loan system would do to the budget. But nonetheless, it might be that there is some wriggle room coming back into that budget, which is now 20 million rather than 16 million. So some of this is obviously economics, but there is, of course, a question over policy intent. The department will have to track decisions on this to the available budget, but we're not clear what it is that the Minister wants to do. So is it going to be the department's policy to increase the provision of grants because of the merits of doing so, or is it simply going to be a budget decision? And that's not something that I have clarity on. But given the extent of destitution to which the fund is having to reach, there is still that fundamental policy choice to be made. So if, and it's not been made in a vacuum, there is a context to this. If you can reduce the demand on the DS budget, if your social security and employment systems are doing what they need to do to provide adequate income, then your policy choices around DS will be different than if you're not able to drive that demand down. So if, for example, you're able to put in place some of the mitigations that were spoken about today, that would inevitably reduce the demand on the DS budget. That's a much more sustainable option, particularly for DS, and a preferable option to avoid rather than to prevent, than to react. So stemming the flow is better, but the policy choice is that you either stop people from being dragged into destitution or you decide to make available the funds that will at least allow them an emergency response to survive once they've hit that state. And so the department's decision is which levers it wants to pull or feels able to pull on that. It might also be worth the committee trying to find out where the Household Support Fund Barnett consequential has gone. So it's not clear whether that actually reaches its intended target of discretionary support or whether that just goes into the general pot that the department has to bid for. Non-ring-fenced funds are obviously much more risky, but perhaps that's something that the committee could review with the Minister and by extension his executive colleagues. But in any event, regardless of that balance between 3 and 1 of loans and grants, we still make the case that there should be an additional grant provision for shell accommodation. So somebody gets a housing executive accommodation, it's unfurnished, they're able to get a grant to furnish it, but they are excluded from that grant provision if they've already had a grant for household expenses. So I know the DS Commissioner has raised that in his report. We identified in our review somebody who had escaped domestic violence. They'd moved with their child into their family home, their mother and father's home. It was very overcrowded, but they needed a bed, and so they got a grant for the bed. They then got their own housing accommodation and were not able to furnish it because the legislation stipulates that you cannot have an additional grant. So we think that there should be an exception made for that, as there is for an additional loan or grant in a disaster. A further point on that is that there was guidance as the budget was peaking in the middle of 2023, and following on from the Secretary of State's budget, which was really quite punitive and reduced the department's budget by 16%. The department started to exercise its powers to put a brake on the DS budget because it looked like it was going to overspend and therefore it was not going to be able to reach the end of the year. What it did was to implement a temporary measure that you couldn't make a repeat claim for the same household item within 12 months. It changed that to 24 months. That was to be temporary. It might be worth reviewing with the department what its status is on that, if there's any information on that that can suggest whether that needs to stay or be retained or be amended. At the very least, what you've got in regulations is 12 months. What you've got in guidance is 24 months. There's a potential for legal challenge there, so it would be prudent for the department to put on record what its intentions are, to either retain, adjust or remove it as a temporary measure, because its continuation, I think, needs to be justified. And the final point on grants is to take the Universal Credit Contingency Fund out of DS, because that is not what DS was intended to do. The UCCF fund is an incredibly important measure. It supports people who are making a claim for universal credit, and in their first 5 weeks they have no income, but it sucks up that one grant provision within DS, and so that doesn't seem to be what the intention of DS was, and so the two policy intents are in conflict, and seems, really unfair. The other recommendation that I draw your attention to is the annual income threshold. The annual income threshold, again, really good policy intent that people who were on a low income, determined by a threshold, so regardless of whether it was low income from benefits or work, would be able to apply to DS. There was nobody who was objecting to that. The difficulty is it's a really blunt instrument, and so the unintended consequence was that you were excluding larger families from applying to DS because their additional income as a large family was putting them over the threshold. The difficulty of nuancing the threshold was that operationally it was going to be too challenging to do that for every single case that came in to make a decision on varied income thresholds. So we tried to balance that, and the conclusion that we came to was that income replacement benefits, which are already targeted as a threshold, are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So use those. Anybody who's on an income replacement benefit, such as UC, could be passported through that income threshold. For those who were not on that income replacement benefit, you would then have a staggered income threshold. And again, not to give them too much publicity, but Landman Economics came to our aid as well on this, and I have no interest to declare in their business either. But we had asked Landman Economics to identify what the income bands might be in order to target, using the Family Resources Survey and their economic modelling, to target where the income threshold might be. So we had a single couple and a pensioner, single and pensioner couple threshold. We identified a child premium, so for every child in the house there was an additional uplift on the income threshold. We recommended that the department also do that for disability, and to its credit the department did. So in relation to the confidence that the department probably has in Landman Economics methodology, the department did go back and has identified what a disability premium would look like. Again, probably worth going back to the department and saying, are these figures, are you confident in these figures now? Maybe they need to be updated. But it would seem that they are at least confident in the methodology, and that would allow you also potentially to remove tax credits and carers allowance from the income threshold, which I think were glitches rather than intention. So that's probably it. There are other aspects, but we might come to those in questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Grania, and I do want to acknowledge the work that you have done in this very important. Discretionary support is a fast, quick support for people who are really at the very, very sharpest end of financial or other difficulties.
And I have to say the department recognises that there's no indication at all that the department wishes to do anything other than protect DS. So there is that.
Thank you. So you'd referred to the budget cut there that came last year to allow the department to live within its envelope of finance. what's your assessment of how that cut has impacted access to or delivery of the support grant?
Well, I suppose that's really for the Commissioner perhaps to take a point on, because our review finished in 2021, was published in 2022. When I spoke to the officials. I mean, obviously it will have had an impact on the ability of people to make a grant application or to make a successful grant application. There doesn't seem to have been a reduction in the success rate, but we don't know what the success rate looks like. So the success rate is recorded as either you're successful in your application or you're not successful in your application, but success in an application can mask what's not been allowed. So you might ask for £250. So we got this as an example. You might ask for £250 for a new fridge or a new cooker, and that would include £50 of delivery and installation charges. You might get £200. So your grant looks like it's been successful, but you're still having to find the money somewhere else. So my guess is that that's likely what has happened, that people will not be getting the full amount that they are requesting. And so I'm not sure if the figures on success rates are going to reveal that full picture. And I don't know what the data by the department is to investigate that further.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead to members because I'm conscious of time. So I have Sean, Kelly and Daniel at this point in time on my list.
Great.
Go ahead, Sean.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you so much for the work you put into this report. You mentioned a little bit about the increases in of eligibility and around family sizes and things like that. Would you support a review of the eligibility criteria on a periodic basis, or how would you see that being able to evolve to react to ongoing need and changing, evolving need?
I'm not a drafts legislative council. I don't draft legislation, but I think it would be helpful if the regulations that were being revised could provide for some mechanism that was amenable to an update in the figures. So it might be a methodology that's employed as opposed to a set figure. The department has been able to adjust certain figures. So the debt threshold, for example, was raised during COVID. It was set at £1,000 and then it was raised to £1,500. The annual income threshold was calculated by reference to the national minimum wage, and that was originally at I can't remember now, 35 hours, 40 hours, and then that was increased. So there's a way to, if you have the methodology in place, if you're saying we're calculating it by reference to figures in the Family Resource Survey or whatever it is Landman Economics is recommending, if those figures change, then there could be a provision for an automatic annual review or an update on that.
I don't want to take up too much time, so let other members go.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. Kelly?
Thank you very much, Grania. Fangirl time again for me. One of the issues that I'm very concerned about is the level of debt that we have in Northern Ireland, and the department itself has recognised that a high majority of the debt is actually repayment to government. Yeah. My concern is when you talked about access to the essentials like food, subsistence, is that we have people who are on universal credit, for instance. They've got the universal credit contingency fund that closes them out of discretionary support loan.
Out of a discretionary support grant.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But where is there anything that we have through the research that you've done about the break point on families that says once this level of debt is incurred, whether it's error by the department or it's personal error, that we get into the destitution? Is there any measurement that actually gives us that point that debt has reached a stage where this is not good for a family or an individual?
We relied heavily on the various income measurements that have been produced by social scientists primarily and economists, and we rely quite heavily on the figures produced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, so their figures on destitution and what a family needs to survive for destitution. They are currently advocating for a minimum income standard, so I think that has updated some of the work since we looked at it back in 2021. And so they're working with the Trussell Trust, as I understand it, on what a minimum income threshold should look like. Anything below that starts to look like destitution. So that minimum income threshold is about being able to meet the basic needs. So it's not, the standard poverty that we might have understood. You can't afford a pint or something at the end of the week. This is not being able to. So when we talk to individuals in the report, we were hearing You know, I'm not eating, I haven't eaten for 3 days because I'm saving money for the children. I haven't been able to put on the heat. I haven't been able to get hot water. I haven't been able to put on the electricity. I haven't got any electricity. So those figures will change over time and will depend on other public resources and other public expenditure and what else is available. So if you've got somebody who, for example, has school-aged children, if the school uniform grant was improved, or if there was something in the Board of Governors that said you didn't need to spend this much money on a school blazer, that will affect how families will work. But we worked off the figures that exist around social science and reviewed a variety of those. But ultimately, I think the Joseph Rowntree Foundation figures on destitution are the ones that we would see as the most connected to our legal standard. So we've done some research on what destitution looks like in law, and under asylum seeker provision, there is a kind of equivalent provision there on what destitution looks like in a legal definition, a common law definition.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask you my next question about the time of the year that people take out the loans, and it tied in, I think, very much to uniform grants and the cost of uniforms.
And of course, this doesn't cover uniform grants because there is a uniform grant. So, you know, if you're asking for money for a uniform grant, you won't get it. But if you're asking for money because you need to buy electricity cards because you've spent it on the uniform, then you will get it. So there is a strange disjuncture there.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly and Daniel.
Thank you, Chair. This is important work, and my office supports people quite a bit with discretionary support applications. And I have to say, just on record, appreciation for all of those who help with the service generally, because they're very, very helpful, very accommodating, very responsive. And I know they've come under pressure at times and there's been delays in responses, but overall our experience is quite good with them. Over the last few years, with the cost of living crisis and other challenges following COVID, we have seen working people pushed to destitute and really struggling. The real challenge we have in our community is that there's no cushion for those people. When the bank runs empty, they are in a very serious situation, are often stuck. And I note that you've mentioned about thresholds earlier, but how best can we ensure, or what can be done to ensure that there's a cushion for those people that pay into the system, that are out working every single day to make ends meet, whose wages have not really increased at all, but their costs have dramatically shot up?
I mean, that's a whole system question, really, isn't it? How do you support people throughout different education systems, employment systems, social security systems, and that's really where this should be focused, so that there is a safety net, but it is for people who have fallen through systems that are working. At the moment, what we have is people who are falling through systems that are broken, and therefore the safety net is having to catch more people. And therefore, because the safety net is itself limited, there are people who are not being caught who we probably ought to be caught. We're looking at a much greater level of need than we would have anticipated, perhaps, when DS came into force. But certainly your point on people who are working and just about managing, but not really very able to manage because the budget is not there from their income. What we're seeing in DS is that you will always need some sort of safety net. So even if we were able to ensure that people's incomes were just about meeting their daily expenditures, they were able to meet food and clothing and lighting demands, there will still be something in the budget that won't be able to be provided for. So DS will still cover things like you can manage your weekly shop, you can pay your bills, and then your fridge breaks down. You haven't got any money in a budget to buy a new fridge, so you will still need something like DS to be able to do that. And as I said at the start, that to the department's credit, it is not looking at removing this safety net. It's whether this safety net can be strengthened, and that's partly about what does the budget look like and who can be eligible within that budget and how many people can access grants and loans. But it's also about looking at things like mitigation so that fewer people fall into the need for DS.
For working people, it's a vicious circle, though, because their income isn't going up in real terms, and they may just be managing just about their budget. But one thing breaking down, whether it be their vehicle, if they're living in a rural area or otherwise, pushes them into debt. They're forced to use credit cards. Then they're having to service that debt, which is adding then to a strain on their budget. So there is a significant problem, and often the criticism that I've heard from working people is that they pay into a system that just doesn't support them. And I think we really need to, particularly the working poor, we need to be doing something more about it. I'm just interested in one particular, Chair, if you indulge me. It's just you propose that the neediest be identified by a passport. What would this be difficult or expensive to administer? And if you could just
Passported
do a wee bit
benefits, so
more.
that
Yeah.
we would identify. So the Social Security system already means tests people for particular benefits, and that is not a high threshold. So if we have a system that is already doing the heavy lifting to identify what low income looks like in order to be eligible for support to meet basic needs, that would work as a passport through that first test of financial threshold. Once you've got through that test, that will take a large cohort of individuals who are applying for DS out, and therefore it will leave more operational capacity for more nuanced identification of income that will reflect the size of the family, the disability premium that's there, whether it's a lone parent or a single or a couple, and so you'll have more capacity then to make sure that those people who are not just on universal credit but working poor, who have low incomes, will also be accommodated within that safety net.
Thank you, Donna. Briefly, Brian, please.
Just to clarify, in terms of the finances of the scheme, it was created in 2016. Is it funded from Westminster, or is this purely from the Northern Ireland Block Grant? So,
I know it's the Block Grant, but there would be Barnett consequentials that have come from the Household Support Fund, which is different, that was boosted following the £20 uplift being removed from universal credit after COVID. So you had a £6 million allocation to universal credit claims that provided them with an additional £20 a week. Once the government decided that was a temporary measure and it was going to remove it, it said it's okay, we've got this household support fund, we're putting £500,000 into it. You can see that there's £5.5 million short, but nonetheless that household support fund, which has been renewed by Treasury and updated by Treasury since then, has provided additional monies to that household support fund, which will have a Barnett consequential, which may or may not have reached DS and therefore would have affected the budget that way. But it is an internal fund, it's not a Westminster fund, which is why when the budget, the Secretary of State's budget hit the department, there's only so much discretionary funding that they can reduce spending on, and discretionary support was one such scheme.
it is one of the mitigations that we run in Northern Ireland. And does the fund end up running out during the year? Or?
It hasn't yet, but it on predictions from July 23, it did look like it was going to, because the demand, if the demand had continued at the same pace as it had up to that point, then it would have run out within a couple of months, and that's why a break was put on it. There is power within the regulations.
It was paused, any more payments?
It was the eligibility criteria were changed so that, for example, the household, on that particular issue, the repeat claim for a household item, so your cooker breaks down, you get £200 to buy a cooker. Within 12 months, that £200 cooker is already broken down. You then, the following year, make a claim for another cooker because your cooker hasn't lasted the year, and it's not one of these ones that comes with a 5-year warranty. The change to the fund meant that you would not be able to make a subsequent claim within 24 months. I don't know whether it's worth bringing Les in to talk about the budget since then to deal with that particular point, but it is an internal budget. It's set by the department. It is intended to match the demand, and 16 million came as a budget that was set originally by the welfare mitigations, the first welfare mitigations group, and it did look like it was holding until additional pressures were put on household finances, and at that point it looked like it was not going to hold, and the department had to exercise its power to put a brake on the funding to manage the budget, so that by the end of the year people could still apply to the fund. May not have got the full amount, but at least would have got something.
Okay, Kelly, we're looking briefly on that very point.
I was just going to say, the current change in the budget, is that potentially a fall? You mentioned that earlier. Universal credit, the move to universal credit is happening at the moment, so there's more people getting the universal credit contingency fund, which would take them out of being able to access a loan at this moment.
My understanding is that there is still room within, so the Universal Credit Contingency Fund has a separate budget heading within DS, so it's not within that original 16 million or within the 20 million as it now is. Again, you might want to take evidence from Les on this. My understanding is that there's a £4.48 million budget and there's a £3.5 million spend on that. So there's still, it's not a budget that has at this point been exhausted. So what it does, it doesn't take from the budget for DS grants, but it does preclude people from applying to that grant. So that might be a reason why.
And Les is kind of confirming that as well there. Ciara, really brief.
Yeah, really brief, and thank you, Grania, for coming along and providing us with a detailed report. I just want to ask, do you continue to meet with the Minister to kind of review the ongoing recommendations? And
I missed the first part of your question.
do you continue to meet with the Minister of the Department to review the recommendations?
I've met with officials, but I haven't met the Minister.
Okay, and just regarding the additional eligibility criteria, where is that at in relation to the officials, department officials, and their thoughts on it?
I think there's a lot of sympathy for those eligibility criteria, and indeed some of them were, some of those circumstances were pointed out to us by DS frontline staff. So, for example, a 16 to 17-year-old can only get DS on their own, under their own steam if they're living independently. But if they're living at home with their parents and they have a child, the grandparent of the baby has to claim for the DS loan. So things like that, and carers allowance coming out, I don't think is problematic. Tax credits equally. The budget being able to be spent in Northern Ireland, I think there's room for an exception there. So the DS frontline staff brought our attention to a claimant who was struggling in Northern Ireland, who had family in Britain, who wanted to move to Britain but wasn't able to get a DS loan or grant in order to be able to move because the money couldn't be spent in Northern Ireland. And similarly, somebody who needed to visit their father who was dying in England couldn't get that money because the father was in England and it wasn't going to be spent in Northern Ireland. So I think there's quite a lot of sympathy towards some of those eligibility adjustments. I don't think that would be a very difficult door to push.
Thank you.
Okay, listen, thank you. And time has, I suppose, beaten us. We could have went on for quite a while more, but I thank members for rushing through that. I'd like to thank you, Grania, for the work you've completed and for your evidence here today to the committee. It's very helpful in our overall consideration. And Les also for contributing there. Thank you for that. So listen, members, there's a couple of things there. I think there's an important point was raised around that temporary status of the 24-month extension. I think we do need to seek some clarity on that from the department.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and also I think we should seek an update on the recommendations, given that the Commissioner isn't see where those recommendations are. They're fairly clear and straightforward, and there would seem to be. So I think if we get an update on those, would be useful. And Kelly, go ahead.
Also, the staggered income, to see if the Minister and the Department have looked and reviewed that, given the fact that it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, members content with that. So I'm going to take a short comfort break, members. So Kelly, go ahead before it.
I was just going to say, on that budget for the Universal Credit Contingency Fund, if we could get an update, because the move to UC is happening now, if we just could get how that expenditure's going for that budget.
How the expenditures run that. Enough for that, Clerk?
Thank you.
Okay, members, so I'm going to take a quick comfort break there for 5 minutes. If we could come back 12:16, 12:20 or 12:21, please. Thank you.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
She like now.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, members. So we'll now resume there at agenda item 8, which is a briefing by the Equality Coalition on an anti-poverty strategy. Members, your briefing paper there is at page 137, and I'd now like to welcome the following representatives of the Equality Commission to our meeting today. Coalition, yeah. So we have Daniel Holder, from CAJ. We have John Patrick Clayton from Unison, Becca Bohr from the NI Anti-Poverty Network, and Trasa Canavan from Bernardo's. So you're all very welcome to this morning's meeting, or this afternoon's meeting as we are now. We do have the paper that you received, so if I could ask you, Daniel, to make pretty brief opening remarks, because I guess there will be a lot of questions from members, and if we could just say in advance, members, if we don't, if time doesn't allow all questions to get put, what we'll maybe do is compile a few questions at the end, so bear that in mind as well, if anything arises that you're really pressing, that you want to get on the agenda. So Daniel, could you go ahead, please?
Thanks, Chair. If it's okay, I'll split the brief opening remarks between myself and Trasa. So the Coalition, as you know, is a network of equality NGOs. There's over 100 of us. Done a lot of work on the anti-poverty strategy, including with member groups like Bernardo's and the Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network in particular. The duty to adopt an anti-poverty strategy, as you will know, has been a legal obligation since the 2006 St Andrews Agreement, and it's been unfulfilled since that time. There was a direct rule strategy at that time. In the subsequent mandate, no strategy was adopted. 2013, we started to engage with the department on that, ultimately took a judicial review in 2015, now 9 years ago, that found the executive had acted unlawfully for not having the strategy. There was a short mandate in 2016, as members will recall. There was no real visible progress on the strategy before the collapse in 2017 to 2020, but there was quite important further case law at that time, not on the anti-poverty strategy, but specifically on the Irish language strategy, and 2 judicial reviews taken by Conor na Gaeilge, which is comparative because it's a very similarly formulated legal duty. And essentially what that found is that certainly is not unlimited time for a new executive to adopt a strategy in particular circumstances, and what it singled out was when a duty has been unfulfilled for so long and the work's essentially been done, which is the situation we find ourselves in with the anti-poverty strategy. Jumped to 2020, and it was very positive. There was a very clear NDNA commitment to the development and adoption of the anti-poverty strategy as quote-unquote an immediate priority of the restored executive, and a lot of work was then done. There was an expert advisory panel appointed by the department in October 2020. It reported in March 2021, provided a very comprehensive blueprint for a strategy. That was then built upon by a co-design group set up by the department. By the time the Equality Coalition and partners had a seminar here in Parliament Buildings in June 2023, it was clear from the department that the work had been done and a draft strategy was ready and sitting there to go to an open incoming minister, to go to the new executive and to go out for public consultation. And really there was an expectation that that was what was going to happen on restoration, but it didn't. Something's changed, something's shifted, and that became very clear when the Permanent Secretary appeared before this committee on the 29th of February. He stated that the strategy was months away from going to the executive, but it was also pretty openly dismissive of one of the core recommendations from the expert groups, the issue of a child payment, which he described as sort of an unsustainable prop, and that was very concerning to us, that sort of all this expert-driven evidence-based work could be just summarily unpicked in that sort of way. The Minister, before the Assembly, 15th of April, I think it was, did say a paper was going to go to the executive rather than the draft strategy, and indicated there'd be some rethinking. Time had passed since initial work, economic circumstances had changed, wanted to reflect on changing priorities. Really, from our perspective, the work's been pretty recent. The themes and the broader circumstances haven't changed very much, and it's not clear how priorities have changed. And really, I suppose at the end of the day, this is a legal duty, and there's not an unlimited time, as we know from the case law, before the executive would be acting unlawfully again if the anti-poverty strategy isn't progressed and adopted. If it's okay, I'll pass to Trasa.
I'll just touch briefly upon the work that has been done to date. As Daniel mentioned, the expert advisory panel and the co-design group were convened, and over the course of about 2 years, they developed a really strong evidence base. This was with experts in the community and volunteer sector, public bodies, academics. It was outcomes-based with a life cycle approach, and also looked at developing an anti-poverty act and commission as well. And the groups worked really hard, not just to look at the evidence out there from Northern Ireland and further afield, but also talking to people who had experienced, real lived experience of poverty. As Daniel said, not an awful lot has changed since then. We've been waiting for an anti-poverty strategy for going on 20 years now. What has changed in the last year and a half that now means we need to put a brake on everything? In fact, if anything, we think families are struggling even more. We also have the Audit Office report that came out recently, and that highlighted the need for a resourced evidence-based strategy that has targets. And in fact, they looked at what the cost of inaction on child poverty was specifically, and they said it was 850 million to 1 billion is the cost of doing nothing. So we're paying that every year because we won't actually address poverty. So really what we're here to say is the work has been done. I'm not going to go through the recommendations in depth because you have them and you know them. We have been waiting for long enough. We need our strategy now.
Thank you. Okay, well listen, I have to say I attended the briefing that you gave up in 115, and I know Conor Murphy also attended that briefing. It is and it should absolutely be a priority for the Executive, and we have pressed the Minister and the Permanent Secretary from the very start. I, like you, am, I think, a bit frustrated, certainly, and also I don't fully understand, given the amount of work that has been done, given the crucial importance of this to so many aspects of our society, not even just those individuals, but collectively as a society. And I do note the cost that you've mentioned there. And that's, you know, the cost that the CAJ has identified in relation to that, or the NAAO. But overall cost beyond that, what would your assessment be of the cost of not doing this?
This is something, and others maybe to chip in, but certainly that this is something that was dealt with in quite considerable detail by the expert advisory panel report. I don't have a figure in my head, but the costs are immense of not dealing with poverty. The cost-benefit analysis coming out of that was pretty clear.
You know yourselves that there has also been calls for actually auditing the reality of poverty and what are the costs for each of the departments. This was raised obviously in the Chamber last week. It has been raised time and time again, and there is a recommendation around having that audit on an ongoing basis. But we know that it is, you know, everything from educational attainment, unemployment, within the health, within the judicial system. You know, we know the costs are extreme, and that is one of the reasons why there was a life cycle approach within the recommendations from the expert panel and from the co-design group, because it looks at people from the very beginning of their lives to try to have the best outcomes. And so I think that is a really important thing to take into consideration.
If I maybe could just come in there as well, I think the cost-benefit analysis is something we do reflect on, and certainly my input into the co-design process from the perspective of NICAC 2 and from wider trade union perspective was looking at issues like low pay, like precarious working, like the need for more collective bargaining across all sectors, both public and private. And it was largely to look at that reality where we have a considerable number of people who are in poverty or in relative poverty, where they are in households where people are in work. So we do have some fundamental issues there about our system, and the benefits or the costs of inaction I think are actually quite well articulated in a sector like social care, which I know, Jerry, you'll be familiar with from your previous committees, where we have a workforce which is generally low paid, many of whom are working in precarious work, but they're delivering an essential public service, the need for which is going to grow more and more acute as we have an ageing population. So there's work that is being done across departments on those sorts of issues. I think one of the reasons we're so keen for an executive-led anti-poverty strategy is to make it holistic and to see it through that executive lens rather than it being one department doing work on a particular area and not linking it into the wider whole. And it's all for the objective of actually dealing with poverty over the life cycle and over a period of time with investment that will deliver considerable benefits economically, but also make services like social care much, much more robust and sustainable in the future.
Yeah. And I think, I'm often struck by the use of the term economic inactivity, and I think it's an absolutely incorrect term and actually unhelpful in terms of, because the real problem and really what's going on is economic disadvantage. And until we tackle it at that level, we will not address that situation. And I think, you know, Les Allenby at the previous session here described it very, very, I thought, colourfully but accurately in terms of we start some people off in lane 8 and then we tie their shoelaces together, as if, you know, so this is why it's fundamental, as you have reiterated very forcefully, and I agree, it is also, and this is maybe a more unique element of it, a legal obligation as well, so making it all the more important. So I'm going to go to members now. I'm going to go to Kelly there in the first instance.
Thank you very much. You've just mentioned there about the impact that there would be, societal impact, so to children, to working families and so on. Has there been any work done actually on the failure to deliver an anti-poverty strategy, the cost it will actually force on the executive through their departments? So what I mean by that is the cost it will have to health, by not having people able to afford the essentials like food and the impact it's going to have to their health and the health system. The justice system, you know, further costs that will be forced up the line to the Department for Communities. Has there been anything worked out on that basis? Because we talk a lot about the societal impact and the impact to the person, which of course is very important, but actually not delivering an anti-poverty strategy means that this executive, as with previous executives, will be actually creating more cost.
Absolutely. I don't have any particular numbers for you on that, and I think that it is something that we'd like to get to the bottom of. However, I would be, I suppose, we're so keen to actually start delivering on an anti-poverty strategy that further work to look at what the cost is over here, or what could we potentially be looking at over there, I think can be sometimes a bit of a distraction from what we need to really be focusing on, which is we know the problem exists and we do know that there is a huge cost. I mean, the audit office being able to put that number on it around child poverty is really useful. We can just extrapolate that out, I suppose, to give us a guide. But I wouldn't want to spend too much more time trying to develop more evidence for something that we know needs to be addressed.
My concern with that is that's the evidence we need to be able to hold the feet to the fire. We know that children are living in poverty and destitute in Northern Ireland. We know that. My issue is that all of the other executive ministers, when they're sitting around that table, are going, that's my money, not actually realising that we're going to harm people in society because their budgets are going to be torn apart by the impact of poverty. I have a concern about that, but my second question is about the potential legal action that may have to be taken again, because as we know, and it was in your paper under section 7, you know, we've already had action has been taken. There was no appeal given, so we have a minister who does not take forward the anti-poverty strategy. What's next legally then?
Before Daniel, if you don't mind, just to pick up on your last question, if that's okay, I think there is evidence around an action and the cost of an action in the area of health. So as I'm sure members will be aware, health inequality is a huge, significant issue in Northern Ireland, and we all know the pressures that are on the health budget and on health services. So there was an executive strategy, Making Life Better, that I think is reaching the end of its term, but strategies like that should be complemented by and form part of an overarching anti-poverty strategy, because the reality is health outcomes right across the whole range of indicators. If you live in the 20% most deprived areas compared to the 20% least deprived areas, you're dying younger, you're more likely to need to go to hospital, you have higher levels of disability, higher levels of childhood obesity, and all of those do have a cost for public services down the line. So I think this is always a bit of a tension whenever we talk about the benefits of early intervention and prevention, which the executive has previously looked at and I think broadly endorsed as an approach. It can be harder to identify the savings you make as a result of that. And I think that maybe goes to your point, Traz, that we know instinctively that it is the right thing to do because it should, in theory, lead to much less pressure on the wider executive budget if people are healthier, if they're better paid, if they're contributing more economically, if they're more likely to be in work. So forgive me, I know you had a second question, Daniel, you might want to...
Legal, what?
Yeah, in terms of the legal one, legal action, of course, is always a last resort, but I'm sure none of us will hesitate to take it if the executive falls into a default position of acting unlawfully again. Just to sort of elaborate a bit on what was said in the case law in 2022, so the most recent piece that was on the sort of reasonably similarly formulated strategy in the Irish Language Act, the High Court held in that instance that the reasonable period of time available to an executive committee to comply with its obligation has to be judged according to all the circumstances. What is reasonable will be shaped inter alia by what has gone before. In the present case, given the lengthy period of failure on part of the preceding executive committees to comply with the legal obligations, that no such Irish language strategy has been adopted at all, and particularly against the background of a previous High Court declaration to this effect, and the renewed hope of expeditious progress in light of the commitments in the NDNA deal, it was incumbent on the executive to act with clarity. It has plainly failed to do so. The question for the court, however, is simply whether the executive has discharged its obligation to adopt a strategy within a reasonable period of time in all the circumstances. It has not. And then the court goes on to state that if individual members of the executive were thwarting the adoption of a strategy, the court could direct enforcement action in the form of a court order in substance and in form at each member of the executive in relation to non-compliance, and only those shown to be thwarting the order might be sanctioned. So I think the courts are starting to get teeth over this. It wouldn't just be a declaration. It would seem to be that given the length of time that's passed, this could land in court if it's obstructed or not progressed again.
I'm concerned that we're into a situation, hopefully today, I hope our executive colleagues will be able to decide a budget. We may have a single year budget and then we may possibly go into a 2-year budget after that. I think it would be unforgivable for an anti-poverty strategy not to land within this 12-month period. So that leads into the next budget period. And to be honest, if there's legal action has to be taken to take a minister to actually take that forward, well then, to be honest, the judgments are there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, and just like it is, it is regrettable that we're not even at the point where that strategy is going to the executive for them, and that issue around what is a paper versus what is a strategy that has already been a huge amount of work done on. So I think we're going to have to keep a very, very firm eye on that and keep a lot of pressure on that. But we'll go now to Moilisa.
Thank you, Rolf. You're all very welcome here too. And when you're talking on a subject or a topic like this, sort of straight away that everyone is totally and absolutely in support of the objectives and that. And I keep asking myself the question then too that, and this applies probably to a whole lot of other areas as well. Why is it that it's not been implemented? You often hear there on television, go to your politicians, or your politicians are responsible for that. And I would think that all of the politicians within the Assembly at the present time would be totally and absolutely in support of the implementation of a legal responsibility that they're faced with at the present time. So what do you really see as being the stumbling blocks there? Is it money? Is it the lack of will on the part of a minister or ministers? Or what is it that prevents this Assembly from moving forward to implementing exactly that Anti-Poverty Act in itself?
Well, I would say it can't be money because we're paying for poverty at the moment. Yeah. So if we're happy to pay for poverty, why aren't we happy to pay for an anti-poverty strategy and actually tackle it? And I think the other part of this, as you say, is the work has been done, and whenever we have events around this, whenever we talk to anybody about poverty, it's absolutely agreed, as you say. Everyone will say poverty is terrible. No child should grow up in poverty. But we now need to see the action on that. And I think sometimes people can feel that this is a big topic, that, oh goodness, all this work has to be done to deliver on it. But we're here to reassure you the work has been done. So let's get to delivering. We appreciate that it's difficult, that we have to make decisions about budget and things like that. But just because a decision is difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't make it. And we should absolutely be going ahead and delivering on this. Whenever we think about the budget, one of the things that I think we would really like to see is a ring-fence pot to address poverty. And that shouldn't necessarily be the responsibility of any one department, but actually it's cross-departmental. We've all talked about how this hits on every single department will see the impact of poverty, guaranteed. So there should be a budget and a pot of money that all departments can avail of. We know that cross-departmental working can be very, very effective. We have things like the Children's Services Cooperation Act, which actually requires our public services, our departments to work together to deliver in the best interests of children. So what we'd really like to say is let's use the levers that we have. We have the resources, we have the power to unpick poverty. It's been woven into the fabric of our society. So let's actually address that and not just sit back and accept it as a status quo. So I think what we really need to see is just brave action, and we need to see that brave action right across the executive to make sure that we're all stepping up and delivering on that.
I think with this,
I'll bring Daniel in and come back to you then, Melissa. Go ahead, Daniel.
There's clearly been a change and a shift since the executive was restored and the permanent secretary came in here. We've very little to go on other than what was actually said at the meeting here, although that was concerning, particularly the dismissal of child payment. That was almost a sort of an ideological objection to support payments. That was quite concerning. It's often quite difficult to get to the bottom of who's blocking what within the executive. It is normally only when there is, and obviously this committee has a key role to play in being able to do that and get to the bottom of what's actually going on. Sometimes we only get a clear picture on the back of litigation. That 2022 court judgment set out quite clearly what was happening, what was being blocked, how many times papers were being blocked and things like that. They're all listed within the judgment. We couldn't have known that outside of the executive before that judgment came out. So there's such a key role for committees and ultimately the courts. It was notable that I think yeah, most 4 out of 5, I think, of the executive parties in 2015, when the High Court ruled on the anti-poverty strategy, welcomed the judgment against the executive. And I hope it won't take litigation to try and pin down what's going on here, that we can see some sort of progress. But that would be the concern, that there seems to have been some shift and there isn't a complete explanation for that so far, but just some indications.
And just a comment, and a fear that I have, or a reservation that I have, is whenever I see comments then that where information has to be updated, it's a wee bit like kicking the can down the road once again, and there's enough information there to allow you to go ahead and to do what has to be done, in my own opinion.
Can I just say something very briefly in response to that, Chair? I mean, I think touching on a remark Daniel made earlier, I think it would be our view at this stage the thematic areas are going to be largely the same. They're going to be around child poverty, low pay, looking at our social security system, looking at examples like the child payment and so on, and how that could be rolled out here. And I should say, I think we are very much up for working again with officials and with the department, and we attempt to do that through the co-design process, to say, here is the evidence and you can update the evidence. But the strategy itself can be a living document. It should be responsive to changing circumstances, and indeed, we accept that the strategy will need to be a multi-year strategy, because this is a complex problem. It's a multifaceted problem. It requires action across all executive departments. So I think what we're actually very keen to have is a draft strategy we can engage with and advise the department and the wider executive. These are the issues we actually think you need to say a little bit more about, or you need to take account maybe of new developments from my perspective around potential new legislation on workers' rights and so on. And I think if we had that would be very, very helpful. But at the moment, we don't actually have even a draft really to engage with and comment on. There's work that's been done, and we're not really certain where that stands. And I think that uncertainty is troubling.
Yeah.
Just first and foremost, thank you all very much. Really, really appreciate not only the work that you individually do personally, but also your organisations and all other organisations that are continuing to get us to this stage. It's quite shameful that it's taken us to get thus far. And it's probably John in particular. A strategy is a strategy. There should be no reason in a delay in publishing a strategy for anti-poverty, because it's really then the core actions and the work that needs to happen. But it's a directive and it's guidance to the departments. And all your proposals generally, we have spoken about these, and we're only back 2 months. All the proposals that are in that you have helped co-design are just 100%. It's 100% approval on them. We need to proceed on them, and we shouldn't have to wait for a strategy either. In particular, and departments should be moving on those key areas. But I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask: next steps. We have a strategy. What in the implementation of it? Because we have to constantly evolve and change, as you say, it has to be a living document. Because even as we've heard our previous speakers, and we need to be more engaged and informed regarding what data we need. So, what do you believe, from a structure point of view, do you require? And I know obviously cross-departmental is important, but how do we do that? But ensuring that it doesn't keep one step removed from the likes of organisations that yourselves that are constantly on the ground and know how things evolve and change and must be part of a process.
And the first thing I think is, if you have your eyes on the strategy, I know you've asked for it, and I don't know if you've actually gotten a chance to see it as of yet. You're shaking your head, so I take that as a no. But I feel like we have to really urge this committee to use the benchmark of the evidence base of the expert panel when you're seeing this, in order to compare, does it have the same philosophy, principles, and evidence-based recommendation of the expert panel? Remember, these are experts that know a lot and have spent years and years and years doing the research and looking against what some members of the co-design group have also published in terms of their recommendations, because the primary assumption of the anti-poverty strategy from the expert panel was that we have to raise the household income of people and reduce their expenditure. So it's not the area, the community, a region at large. Household income needs to go up. So looking at real living wages, looking at the benefit system, pensions, the welfare mitigation, all those things are part of that. And so that has to be the crux of it. And so I think there is, going back to Melissa's question before, around what is the holdup. I do think there is possibly, because we haven't seen the strategy, but possibly a disagreement around how do we actually lift people up from poverty. And what we have to say is, look at the evidence, look at the London School of Economics, look at what Joseph Rowntree Foundation, look at the reality of the £20 uplift of universal credit over the COVID period. Look at the difference of mitigations here than England and Wales right now. There's differences in child poverty. We're actually, in some ways, dreadful to say that 1 out of 4 children is better, but it is better than in some areas of Northeast England and Wales. Why? Because we have a benefit cap. We have mitigations here. We have to remember that, but we can't take those for granted. We need to continue on that work, and we have to use that evidence base in order to move forward.
Go ahead, Charlie.
In terms of implementation as well, I think that this is something the co-design group looked at, because what we really didn't want to have was a strategy. We have lots of lovely strategies that go nowhere, so we thought about how we kind of bring that strategy to life and how we make sure that we continue to deliver, that it is a strategy that's flexible and can respond. Because I suppose if we had written a strategy in 2019, it wouldn't take account of COVID, and yet that completely reshaped everything. So we need to be able to respond and flex. What we suggested was that the co-design group, or a co-design group, continues to work alongside a cross-departmental group as well, and that they work in tandem with each other to continue making sure that it is delivering, getting feedback from on the ground, and making sure that if we have to tweak and change, we can do that there's flexibility there. I think also one of the suggestions of the co-design group and the expert panel was around a commission, an anti-poverty commission, and that's really important for hearing that lived experience, because we can talk in the theory about poverty, we can talk about the impact on families, but actually going to see families, actually hearing directly from parents who are struggling to put food on their kids' plate, who are struggling to get them new clothes for school, that's going to absolutely shift your perspective. And in fact, when I think about the impact of COVID, we knew in a charity as Bernardo's that things were happening and there was an impact on families long before we saw the statistics, because we heard from our services, families are coming to us and telling us that while they've been put on furlough, their bills haven't been put on furlough. And I remember that kind of completely shifts your perspective. I'm like, oh, you're sitting at home, that's great, you're getting paid. Actually, it didn't cover their bills. And that's what parents told us. So how do we make sure that that voice and that experience is central to what we're doing throughout implementation is going to be key. So I think the work of the sector needs to continue, that the co-design principles need to continue, but we need to make sure that that experience and that voice of lived experience is central to all of this as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, John Powell.
Just to add, I think Traz has covered the point about the commission and continuing to be informed by lived experience very, very comprehensively. I think one thing as a co-design group we were also keen on was that the strategy had an action plan, an accompanying action plan. So, you know, if it's a multi-year strategy, very clearly defined actions, policy actions, and clearly linked to the executive budget and dates around implementation, I think all of that would assist a great deal in ensuring it is responsive. And if economic circumstances change, as we know they do, if budgetary allocations change, if I suppose something that has changed is we do have this much more clearer debate about the fiscal floor in Northern Ireland and our level of funding commensurate to need and so on, that the strategy can take account of that, and maybe how you prioritise actions and at what pace you do actions can change as a response. So I think that would be a very, very helpful thing to have with the strategy as well.
Thank you. A lot to be concerned about there, I have to say. And even though we have been pressing and we have been urging from day one of this committee, I think, for this strategy we brought forward, I think we need to write again to the department and to the executive, in light of the need to, first and foremost, address urgently the poverty levels that we're seeing there and support people, but also in light of the legal jeopardy. I think we need to ask both of them where this is at, what the delays are, and what their assessment is in terms of the outstanding legal position. Kelly?
I was just going to say, could we actually add into that the fact that we don't have a cross-departmental anti-poverty strategy agreed at the moment? Perhaps we could add to that letter to say, do the departments who are impacted by poverty, have they taken poverty into account in their budgeting? Because
and maybe from ourselves right to all other committees as well. Have they been liaising with the Minister and asked all departments as well maybe to write to the Minister?
Yeah, I think that's all
departments.
Yeah.
Committee has been asked by other committees to look at this already.
Okay, well, listen, I want to thank you all for the work you've done to date, for the attention and the very expert opinions you still bring to bear on that, and I think that is something that I would urge you to continue to do. I think it's going to have to be kept right under the microscope in order to be pushed forward and delivered on. Time is of the essence here, given how much work has already been completed. So thank you for your presentation today, and we look forward to speaking with you all again at some point.
We look forward to seeing that strategy.
Yeah,
so do we.
Thank you very much. Okay, members, content then, we'll move on then to the next item on our agenda, which is the SL1 at agenda item 9. So this is the Social Security State Pension Age Claimants, Closure of Tax Credits Regulations NI 2024, and the Welfare Reform NI Order 2015 Commencement Number 13 and Savings and Transitional Provisions Amendment, and these are at page 144. The purpose of the proposed regulations and order is to make a range of amendments to social security legislation to support people over state pension age who are currently in receipt of tax credits, either child tax credit and working tax credit, to move to either universal credit or pension credit before HMRC closes the tax credit system from April 2025. Do members have any comments, or are they content for the Department to proceed to make that rule and order? Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
I'm content for the Department to make the rule. However, it would be useful to have an update from the Department on the position that we have where couples, one is a pensioner and one isn't a pensioner, that's on universal credit, and how this will impact that situation. Because we're finding more and more people now are not getting all of the opportunities that they can because of that age difficulty.
Yep. Yeah, good point. Members content with that? Yep, thank you. Members, then, in table papers, we have in SL1 also the Local Government Remote Meetings Regulations NI 2024. So this is in relation to the hybrid committees. You have a copy of the SL1 at page 30 of the table papers, the page 30 of your table. The proposed statutory rule will make provision to enable District Council to hold meetings remotely or by hybrid means, including by, but not limited to, telephone conferencing, video conferencing, live webcast and live interactive streaming. It's proposed that the rule will come into operation as soon as possible. And in response to questions indicated by members of the committee after table papers were issued, the Department was asked for further detail in relation to the conditions or criteria that a member would have to meet to attend a meeting remotely. So we have received that, members. I know the clerk has circulated to you all there. I suppose just to note the history of this is that we had approved that this would be taken forward via the COVID regulations to allow the work to continue on the more substantive ones. The Minister allowed those COVID ones to lapse, and it has now brought, and that's creating difficulties in itself. However, we are now back in a situation where it's bringing forward. So I'll ask for members' comments. I've had a look at the members for the departments for the clarification, but members' comments, please.
Can I just thank the clerk and yourselves and the DALO for the additional clarification, because up until that point I was very concerned that the conditions that were being brought in were unseen to ourselves, but now we've had a little bit more clarification that there should be a copy across from the coronavirus regulations. Then I'm more than happy for this to continue. I wasn't whenever we were sort of being kept in the dark of what actually was being thought about, but no, this other letter has been very helpful today. Thank you very much.
Marisa?
And just to the chair, this rule and it's been implemented, does that apply to all councils, or will councils have the option of opting out?
Well, what the update has said that the regulations will provide councils with flexibility on the same basis as the previous COVID regulations, with flexibility to decide which meetings may be held by remote hybrid means. Each council will be required to make standing orders to put that into effect.
Yeah, it says the council may as they may determine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's up to them.
So I have to say, my own point of view is I think this has provided some very late in the day, albeit, and that's a wee bit regrettable in itself, but it does provide some, and I think I would be reassured that it is taken the flexibility that was there from COVID in, and that it would appear for this meeting will include potentially all meetings of councils based on what councils decide to progress.
The only question I would have, with what we've been proposed with and the fact it's going to copy across the previous coronavirus legislation, a question I would like to ask to the department is, if a council decides not to invoke the legislation, can the department clarify if they will be subject to equality legislation then? Because it does have an impact on people with dependents and rural dwellers and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a key point. Okay, yeah. So I think we'll take clarification on that then, and we'll come back, bring it back, Claire.
I'll send that back in writing.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Okay.
Chair, just to say, pardon me, just welcome that the Minister has done what he said he would do, that he would bring forward this provision, and it'll be up to each council to set their own standing orders and conditions for this. As he said, he felt that COVID was no longer a reason or the basis for providing for this with the emergency provision that was brought in then, but he has now brought in that opportunity for each council to make its own rules about this. So he has done what he said he would do.
Okay. Okay, then, and given we've asked for that clarification, Kelly, but would members be content for the department to proceed to make the rule on the basis of what we know at this point?
Great.
Yes. Members content, thank you. Okay, members, moving on to agenda item 9 there, correspondence. I refer you to memo at page 152 of your meeting packs. Do members have any comment on any of the items of correspondence? Yeah, and we have, so there's two in particular that I want to flag. So there's a Cavendish Consulting for members to decide if they wish to receive a briefing, and there's also a Playboard NA request to brief committee. And I think maybe I might suggest members, up to members to decide, but maybe we are doing a planning session next week. Maybe we put these in to see how we factor all, because we obviously have a huge amount of issues there to balance and juggle.
Week after next.
Week after.
Next, yeah.
Panicked.
Yes, sorry, I was week after next. So if we can bring that forward to the end, and we can maybe see where all those lists of requests that we have. Are there any other items there that members wish to highlight, either in the pack or in the main pack first, and then we'll come to the table papers.
Yes, sorry. I brought this up whenever the department were here, and Paul Price, who's over HED, it's that individual that's written in about the thatched roofs. There seems to be an issue going on there. If we can maybe just get an update from the department, from the Historical Environment Division, and what's happening with thatched roofs. I know it's a very specific matter, but there's potential to lose these historic roofs if we don't look after it. So just even an update on the department from that.
Members content?
Yeah, and just to note, and like Kelly, obviously I met with a number of owners of thatched roof properties, and I did write in to the Minister, and particularly in relation to the thatched roof itself and the 12-inch, obviously, and the ridges and stuff. So they did mention that they are reviewing it, and likewise they're reviewing obviously the cap on the 12k, but still there isn't enough investment in. And these are family homes, people's living in these homes, and they're holding these properties for obviously austerity for ourselves to be able to appreciate and enjoy, and as part of our heritage. So I think just as a point, it's important as a committee that we acknowledge what is required to help sustain and support owners of such properties, and very much would support removing the cap in relation to the current heritage fund, which is currently sits at 12k, and owners were saying it could be 60, 70k for them every few years. But likewise, the ridge and the specification needs to change, because at the minute there has been some work that hasn't been great, whereby you're having to go back 5-6 years later to repair the roof again, or to remove and replace the roof. Whilst if it's done properly, it could last 15-20 years. So.
I think as part of the update, maybe could we get an assessment of what the impact of removing the cap would be? I think that we should ask that to be included.
Yeah.
Members?
And for an update,
just
where the review is.
Okay.
Yeah, general update. Okay, thank you. Are members always consent then with the main correspondence memo?
Yes. Yep.
And then the table correspondence was all basically press releases. Members content to note the memorandum in the table correspondence? Yeah, thank you, members. Agenda item 10 then, forward work programme. Clerk, do you want to just give us a very brief run through of the next couple of weeks, including the planning day?
Yeah, certainly. So my intention is to bring an outline agenda of the planning day to committee next week for review and input. But the meeting next week here is the last opportunity really for briefings in advance of that planning day. We have an update on the disability strategy input from people who were on that panel, and we're due to receive briefings from NICFA and Sport ANI. After that then, on the planning day, I'll do a short review of how committee members feel these sessions are going, and we can discuss the list. There is a list of people who have indicated they would be willing to brief. Based on the planning day, then members can identify the priorities for those going forward to the end of the summer, and we'll bring the very latest update if I have one in terms of the other priorities coming from the department that we'd need to look at between now and the end of the summer. Probably after the planning day, the ambition would be to have a long list for the department or for the committee, which we could continue to revisit probably in the autumn, probably when we have more clarity on what's coming at us, and then call those priorities off one by one.
And actually, I just flagged to members to think about this, but during the Health Committee, which is previously pressurised in terms of the scale and the scope of people wishing, there were times that we would have, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 committee members would have organised a briefing that they have some particular expertise in. Do that, take the evidence from members, maybe via Zoom or something like that, and then report back to committee. So it was another way to get information directly in front of committee. So just to give members that to think about before we can discuss it further at the planning day, but it's something maybe it would allow us to cover a bit more ground without.
I was just going to say, this committee, the previous mandate, was inundated with legislation. We do probably the most legislation of all the committees. And when we start taking evidence, we have time for nothing. We were doing evening meetings once a week with youth sector, this sector, that sector. So we need to think realistically about our plan, because we don't know what the minister's going to do with this legislation, and we could be completely inundated.
Yeah. Fair point.
No, just reiterate from the previous 3 meetings.
I mean, on that, are there currently legislation that's in the pipeline that we know of?
We don't have confirmation in writing from the department in terms of the list of legislation. I summarised for a committee a couple of weeks ago what we've taken from briefings so far. So we've an indication that there's going to be a short bill on pensions auto enrolment. We'll see it imminently. We have an indication on the defective premises just recently. We have had an indication of one on child support enforcement, which is a parity bill, and confirmation in a ministerial statement of sign language legislation. So they have all been discussed, but nothing firm in writing.
We'll have that list for the planning day as well.
No.
Well,
not confirmation.
Well, I just think we need to factor it in, you know,
yeah.
Just allowing for the time it might take, you know.
We have an outstanding, I think, request to the department to give us written confirmation, so hopefully that will
it's an issue
bring whatever pressure you can to bear by all means. But
to be honest, this is an issue I think for every committee, that we're not seeing from some of the ministers what their legislation, to the effect that there's another committee is actually bringing forward and changing standing order to require it. So.
And sorry, Chair, one other question. Are there any, there's no committee inquiries then as such because of the gap that there's been, or is there any that are somehow at any stage in the process? No?
No. It would be for this committee to identify following this planning day. If this committee wished to commence an inquiry, any previous inquiries would have finished or lapsed, and it would be for this one to identify.
Before to do inquiries.
Okay, thank you. So members, are you content then to note the forward work programme?
Yes.
Yeah. Item 11, any other business? Committee members, any other business? Sean?
I know I sound like a bit of a broken record because I brought it up last week to the Minister. There was an article in the Belfast Telegraph last night where the Minister said, in relation to casement, we can't go forward and start any further stage of the process until we know exactly how much we're getting from them. We need to know what their contribution is going to be, being the British government. The Secretary of State in a very recent interview said, well, we can't tell how much it's going to be because we don't know how much it's going to be yet. So we are currently in a state of
losing it.
We're hitting a brick wall. So on the back of my suggestion last week I know that there had been reference to the Secretary of State. I wonder, can we as a committee directly write to the Secretary of State and ask exactly what the process is? The Minister Lyons has said that he has written to the Secretary of State. Heaton Harrison, I'm waiting for a response from him. And so before the reconstruction work goes out to tender and dealing with procurement issues, we need to have some surety that we have the funding to proceed. We are literally weeks away from losing the Euros.
And I mean, there is a commitment to Casement Park. Casement Park will have to be
100%.
built. The question is whether or not we will miss or get the advantage, the benefit, or miss out on hosting those European.
You have the Secretary of State saying, I don't know how much to give, I don't know what commitment to give because we don't know how much. And you have the Minister saying, well, I can't tell him how much until we get an assurance that they're going to give us the money. Yeah. It's chicken and egg here, and I think that we are in a desperate situation.
Just to follow up on that, can we actually clarify, if we do lose the Euros, does that mean that we lose all of the other investment for Casement, then putting Casement development completely out of reach?
Well, we can ask for that clarification, yeah, certainly. We can ask for the assessment of that.
Would it be worth, Chair, at some point, I'm saying it's something we can talk about next week, is it worth having a visit from the IFA and from Ulster GAA? Actually, and if it has to be a closed session to be able to talk about some of those more sensitive issues around procurement or around money, would that be?
Well, I think to be quite honest, I think that sort of potentially could deflect. It is the minister's, in my opinion, the minister's responsibility. I think we are, in terms of the committee position, we are very keen to see those European that Euro 28 being secured. Keen to see Casement being built. I would just be concerned that we're feeding into that. To me, there's a number of things need to be done, including by the Minister and the department here, and then there's others around Fontaine. But I think for now we should seek the urgent update in relation to what you've flagged there.
So there was a letter went from last week's committee to the department and to the Minister. So this action is specifically to write to the Secretary of State to outline the process from the NI perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. In addition to those, yeah. Okay, thank you. And
would it be useful just on the CPD, Central Procurement Directive as well, just to see clarity on the tendering process? What stage Casement is at, and is it a design and build? And I've done procurement in the past where you can have break clauses in, at stage 3. Depending on what funding you have available to proceed, so at least it can get started. So maybe just some directive
for finance
through CPD, but that's particularly CPD.
Yes.
They will be able to give us clarity on what you can proceed with.
Yeah, I think written information will be very
and information on the break clauses that you can include, depending on what funding you have, which is normal practice. So.
Okay, thank you, members. So moving on then, any other business? Moving on then to item 12, date, time and location of next meeting. Our next meeting will be here at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 25th of April in room 29 here in Parliament Buildings. The meeting is now adjourned, and I'll ask the clerk to take us out of public briefing.
Committee Room 29, sound. Committee Room 29, sound. Committee Room 29, sound.